I'll be continuing in a couple of minutes, guys. If the students are. Chalu, when we say sear, it is the stage of succession, right? So that is why we refer to it as serial stages also. In succession, when we refer to it as the serial stages also. That is what is sear. Pre-sear, the first kind of succession which happened. Sub-sear, the second kind of succession which happened. Okay. When we talk about the formation of life on land, right? So on land, how is it that life came into existence? You basically had initially the presence of lichens. Lichens came over, right? Because the conditions on the ground surface at that point of time, when the lava was still cooling down, at that point of time, the conditions were so very harsh that neither any plant nor any animal could survive on the ground surface. Meanwhile, in the oceans, you already had life which had been initiated, but over the region of the land, you initially had the rocks, many of those rocks in a very difficult terrain. So that is when the lichens they started growing, and they continued to grow for millions of years. And in those millions of years, the lichens basically weakened the rocks, and they basically created the soil. And that ended up creating a situation for the plant species to come into existence, the mosses, because that thin soil allowed the mosses to come through. And this is basically succession which is happening, right? And the mosses, basically, they are so very small, the greenish tinge that you see on the rocks. Now they have almost microscopic thin leaves. And that is where they also dominated for many, many millions of years. You had the planet covered in mosses, many portions of the planet covered only in mosses. And then eventually, unless and until lignin came into existence, lignin, I hope you are aware, is a compound which provides strength to the plants. So only when the lignin came into existence did the plants they start to grow taller. Otherwise, everything would be stuck onto the ground. So all of this is basically stages of succession, serial stages. Okay. Um, Shravani, the tunnel issue in the region of Uttarakhand. See, right now it is making all the national headlines. So that is why right now I understand that is a point, and that is basically something that everybody across the news media is concentrating upon. But it is on the same lines, the discussion that you have when we talk about, let's suppose, sinking of land in the region of Joshimat, when we talk about the occurrence of avalanches and landslides in the region of Himalayas. That is basically Himalayas, they are a kind of a very critical ecosystem and a fragile ecosystem for that matter. If you want to dig a tunnel through the region of Alps basically are much more stable, they are much older. Himalayas, inside them, you have the presence of these sedimentary rocks and also the availability of various different sources of water. Water actually comes in. So that is why it is always prone to having that subsidence. And that is why you experience these kind of things, such as for example, around last year or year before that, Joshimat was there everywhere. Everywhere in every news story, you only heard about Joshimat. And why was that? That was again because of the simple problem that the land was sinking underneath the region of Joshimat. Why? Because there also you had these sedimentary rock systems along with the sediments, and that can never withstand the heavy weight. Now, in the case of the tunnel issue, obviously it will collapse, and I don't want to get into the details of what auger machine is going to do, what rat hole miners are expected to do. But basically, all of this is because of if the Himalayan system would be composed only of igneous or metamorphic rocks, such kind of collapses would not have been experienced. It is the sedimentary nature of the formation. Okay. Kishore, when any creature goes into hibernate mode, why it can't decompose? See, decomposition will happen basically in the dead organisms. In the dead organisms, slowly and steadily, you have the fungal growth which happens, right? And in fact, in the geological history of the planet also, when the fungi evolved, they basically would cover those particular plants, etc. But there also understand that in these species, you hibernation doesn't mean the heart stops. The heartbeat reduces quite significantly. The body heat is still there, right? And you will not have any of the living organisms basically experiencing decomposition. When does decomposition happen? When you have microbial action taking place. When does microbial action start taking place? When you have the portions which are dead, which are not having any functionality anymore. So that is when the phaging system of the body starts. So it is still alive, and it is still very much alive and kicking. A hibernating animal, if push comes to shove, can wake up again, right? That is why it is always told never go near the hibernating bear. Okay. Mulching is something in agriculture that we have covered already in the class, Kishan. Mulching is basically when you cover the agricultural farmland or field with maybe dried grasses, straws, twigs, biodegradable plastic, anything that you do in order to conserve and preserve the soil moisture. That is the process of mulching, right? I think you have attended sessions of geography also, Kishan. So just go into the details of it, that in the portion of agriculture we have dealt with the portion of mulching. So the soil, if it is exposed to the outside air, will continue to lose its moisture, will harden in terms of excessive heat, will be prone to soil erosion, etc. But that is why when you cover it, that soil moisture is retained, then the soil fertility is retained. Excessive heat, excessive cold conditions don't impact the soil. And that is akin to, as I have always maintained, that leaving the soil barren and leaving the soil open is like having a wound on your arm and you leave it open. So very soon it will basically get damaged, right? Similarly, soil should never be left exposed. And how it helps to control smog. Because see, when you have the mulching which is done, so the presence of these strong winds will never allow the soil to get carried away. In the northern portion of the country and in the particularly northwestern portion of the country, what is observed is that lack of rainfall creates such dry conditions. Those of you belonging from those areas would always attest to the fact, even for that matter, in the region of Telangana, in the region of eastern Maharashtra, in some portions of central and western Madhya Pradesh, Karnataka, Uttar Kannada district, in western Tamil Nadu, there also you experience this. When the conditions become very dry, the soil, if you would have observed it from your own experience, the soil turns into a kind of a particle like structure, sandy structure. It happens, right? If it is dried for a prolonged time, much more sandy structure develops in the soil. So then when the wind blows, all those small dust particles will be carried by the wind, and all of these will add as pollutants, PM5, PM10, PM2.5, into the atmosphere. It aids pollution. It carries on soil erosion as well. But if you cover the farmland, then this can be solved. Okay. And then after that, why Himalayas, whole Himalayas is sedimentary? No, not whole Himalayas. The Great Himalayas, that is the Himadri, that is igneous and metamorphic. The middle and the lower and the outer Himalayas, they have sedimentary rocks which are present. In the middle, however, few of the rock systems, they have converted into metamorphic, but that is not the case in the entirety of the formation. Within that also, you will have pockets of only sedimentary systems. Within that also, you will have pockets of metamorphic rock systems, etc. Okay. I think I have addressed all the stuff. Shalu, you had a question about edge effect. Edge effect is basically when we talk about an ecotone, for example, an ecosystem A, an ecosystem B, this will be your ecotone, the zone of transition. Now, in this zone of transition, for example, before that, when we talk about ecosystem A, here, which species will be living here? Let's suppose we talk about here forest. Let's suppose we talk here about desert. In the forest, which kind of species will live? Only those which are adapted to this, only those which are adapted to these conditions, isn't it? Here, only those which will be adapted to the desert ecosystem. But here, in this transition zone, in this area, you will find those species which are adapted to a kind of a forest ecosystem. Here, you will find those species such as reptiles, lizards, etc., who are adapted to desert ecosystem. And here in the grassland, you might find some new species altogether, like the rhinos, right? Like the hippos, which you won't find in either of them, but you'll find them in the grassland. So in this ecotone, generally the population is much higher as compared to the diversity that you consider. That is always considered to be in certain cases higher as compared to individual of these ecosystems. That is your edge effect. Okay. Sundaresh, do get in touch. Uddhav, how to remember all types of forests and all their characteristics? You don't have to remember all the characteristics. And across the world, you don't have to learn the forest division across the world. Many of the candidates do that. They start learning the different forests across all the world, not required for UPSC. You are here to clear the exam, so study only what is required for the examination. So that is where please stick to the Indian Forest Division. And how do you do that? So basically, you carry out the study of the climate, the rainfall distribution. Once you understand the rainfall distribution in different areas, then automatically get an idea that evergreen forest grows in the regions where the amount of rainfall is higher than 220 centimeter. Then, for example, semi-evergreen goes into the region where you have 190 to 220 centimeter of rainfall. So once you have that clue, that how much amount of rainfall is required, more than sufficient after that. After that, not much of an effort is required. Is nitrogen fixation? Santosh, I'm in Bangalore as of now. Kishan, is nitrogen fixation in mulching solution for stubble burning? It can be one of the temporary ones, but then for stubble burning, you need to change the entire paradigm of agricultural setup in the northwestern part of the country. You need to basically go for the changing of or crop diversification. You cannot expect the farmers to have 14 days time window or 7 days, 10 days time window to get their farm ready for the wheat crop and still manage to uproot each of these hard stubble. And this has been a rise due to or this has been come into prominence due to the fact that you also have aspects such as the Punjab Groundwater Act. Now, that as per that act, in order to conserve the groundwater of Punjab, the sowing of wheat has to happen post June itself. So that means it will be harvested in the month of October itself, right? But then in Punjab, anyways, you are carrying out that process of irrigation, and then you are carrying out the paddy cultivation. So why not allow it to happen in the month of June? Why to wait till end of July? So if you plant those paddy crops in the month of June, you can harvest them by the month of September. The farmers will have 2 months to clear the land, so then stubble burning will automatically reduce. So there, but then what about the groundwater conservation? So groundwater will be conserved only if you ensure that paddy, sugarcane, etc., they are not grown in Punjab. They should never be grown in Punjab because Punjab is not a suitable landmass for that. So grow vegetables there, grow fruits there. The farm income can increase by almost 12 times if you grow the non-food crops. But the problem there is the very simplest of the problem, and that is that if you grow rice and wheat, I can sell it to the government will give us money, the MSP. For others, I will have to explore the market and then I will have to sell it out. It is just like why people prepare for those government jobs. I have security in mind that regardless of whatever I do, the government is going to pay me salary. If I go for a private sector, if I go for freelancing, there is a lot of unpredictability. So people are afraid to venture out. So that is one of the issues that needs to be tackled. India State of Forest Report 2023 is important for prelims. Absolutely, yes. And Devansh, did UPSC ask only those committees, conventions, questions which are there in current affairs? Yes. Okay. Now, we move ahead. So, in the last class on Friday, we have had a discussion about the aspect of the biomes. We have had a discussion about the different types of biomes and the adaptations indicated by the species in these areas. Because the species, ever since the evolution of life, they have shown remarkable level of adaptations. And adaptations are the only way to survive in the changing environment. For example, when we talk about the desert ecosystem, I don't know how many of us are aware. At one point of time in history, you had the condition where, and I'm talking about almost 300 million years back, you had a situation where the entirety of the Pangea landmass was almost a desert, right? And there, initially, you didn't have plants, but the plants, or initially, you had these lizards. They started dominating. And why could they dominate? Because for lizards, they don't require a source of water to survive. They basically will consume the flies, they will consume the small insects, and that will be like amount of or the source of water for them, right? So only those species who have been able to adapt, only those species have been able to survive. Others have been pushed down the window of extinction. So these adaptations that you see in different areas, for example, the species around you that you come across, when you go out, maybe when you take a look at, let's suppose, the dogs, the cats, all of them have indicated a massive amount of adaptation. The fishes, for that matter, the fishes themselves, the way that they have adapted, in the sense that the fishes, they had the ability suddenly to swim in different direction, which changed the entire paradigm of the ecosystem of that area. So these adaptations that you find in the marine ecosystem, in the terrestrial ecosystems, in the various biomes, that is something which is essential to be noted, which is essential to be understood. Then we looked at the aspect of eutrophication. We understood why that eutrophication happens. Eutrophication is basically overloading of the aquatic system with nutrients, right? Nutrients in the sense of nitrates, phosphates, etc. Now, they can be generated by the runoff water. They can be generated basically because of, let's suppose, untreated sewage, etc. Agricultural produce, all of that will lead to a lot of eutrophication. Now, this eutrophication is not only observed over the ponds or lakes, these can be observed over large areas also. And it gives rise to algal growth, a very harmful algal bloom, right? Which basically makes the entire ecosystem of the aquatic region devoid of oxygen. And that is when basically you have a lot of dead species which start floating on the surface. You'd be interested to know that basically millions of years back, roughly around 500 million years back, you had a condition when, due to the sudden plant growth, around 400 million years back, due to sudden plant growth in every parts, all that runoff water which came to the seas, that led to eutrophication of the water. And you had almost large sections of the water body of the planet covered under green algae. Now, these algae, they died. And these algae, basically, when they died, they again created that kind of a oxygen depleted seas of the world. And it was during this phase when the planet witnessed the second mass extinction. And by this time, the life on land had not developed so much, but eutrophication in the water basically led to extinction of many of the larger species in water, which allowed some of them, when you have larger competition taken out of the picture, the smaller ones, they get a chance to live. And during that second mass extinction, when you had eutrophication carried out all across, at that point of time, you had few of them who managed to survive, and few of them actually they survive even today. And the example of that is basically the species of sharks. They survived that, and they are presently also the apex predator, almost a kind of apex predator today also. So that is where eutrophication happens everywhere. Now, that eutrophication in the region around Florida gives rise to the growth of red algae. And that red algae, that is what gives the common phenomena the name of red tides. Okay, so that is given by the red algae. Okay, so that is basically the things that we have covered. Now, today we will initiate the discussion from the portion of wetlands. What do we understand by wetlands? So, when we talk about wetlands, the name in itself is self-descriptive, a land which has got sufficient amount of water. We are not talking about seas and oceans and the rivers here. We are talking about those areas which represent sometimes a transition between an aquatic system and a terrestrial system. So that transition, right? For example, a small lake or a pond, not a pond will be very small, but let's suppose a lake-like feature, a reservoir for a dam. Now there, you will have certain areas which are so very shallow, where the plants can also grow, right? Where the plants can also grow, they can rise above and they can carry out the photosynthesis. But you will have availability of water as well. So those are basically, these transitioning areas are your wetland. If you have to go for the exact definition of it, wetlands mean those areas that are inundated or saturated by surface or groundwater at a frequency and duration sufficient to support, under normal circumstances, they do support a prevalence of vegetation, typically adapted for life in saturated soil conditions. So they will allow the vegetation growth to happen. They will allow the sustenance of life to happen in that area also. So the swamps, marshes, etc., they come under the category of these wetlands. Now, these wetlands, they are a boon to the ecosystem of a region. How? So first things first, these wetlands, they are quite significant for the variety in biodiversity. Yes, paddy fields will also come under wetlands. These are your temporary wetlands which get created, where for paddy cultivation you flood the land and then you grow you plant the saplings and you allow them to grow. So once the water evaporates, then it's no longer a wetland, but as long as that inundated water condition is there, it is a wetland. Okay. And are these the areas where amphibians are found? Yes, absolutely. So they provide a significant variety in biodiversity. They can support the amphibian species, as many of you have said. They can support one of the most numerous species that you find across the planet, and that is the insects. Insect population quite significantly will be supported by them. And insects, by the way, are very vital. We might think about insects as a kind of a nuisance, but they're very, very vital. Had the entire species of insects not been in existence, then basically the flowering plants would not have managed to reproduce, right? So these insects are very, very important. Now, they will support them. And because you have so many insects, some of the small fishes also which are able to survive, large variety of birds will come to that area. Whenever you hear about migratory species of birds, that during the winter all the species they migrate to the south because they don't want to tolerate the very harsh conditions back home. Where do these birds come to? They come across and over these wetlands. All over the country you have various different wetlands that these birds come to in order to gain access to food, in order to basically reproduce, and in order to withstand a kind of a tolerable condition. Now, to add on to that, these wetlands, they also act as natural purifiers. They also act as natural purifiers. And what do we mean by natural purifiers? Basically, let's assume you have a kind of a small river or a kind of a small stream. And when I say a river, don't start imagining Ganga and Brahmaputra meeting and creating Sundarbans. Come at a smaller scale. A smaller river, for example, let's suppose. Now, this is a smaller river, let's suppose. Now, many of the times in the river flow, you would have observed that in certain areas, you have the region of accumulation of water. right? In certain areas, you have the accumulation of water, not very deep, but some accumulation of water, where basically the river, due to the presence of the lowland, the river water gets wider. Here you will find plants also growing, but partly submerged in water. I'm sure many of you would have come across this particular scenario, right? You have that accumulation of water, the plants growing in that region. So these are your wetlands. I'm not talking exactly about the oxbow lakes, but in general, I hope you would have seen that when the river moves, it does not always move like what you see in the pictures or the images. Sometimes certain areas, they get very shallow, where you will have the plant root. They serve as the wetlands. Now here, the flow of water is going to be very, very less, almost like static condition, right? Very slowly the water will move. So all the heavy contaminants which are there, they will be stuck here. Within the plant growth, within the vegetation growth, the heavy contaminants will be trapped here. And the contaminant-free water then slowly and steadily seeps through, gets back into the channel. So that is why these wetlands, they have the ability to trap the heavy contaminants and provide a sort of cleaner water back into the system, right? So here you will have larger, heavy contaminants getting trapped in the vegetation and cleaner water goes through. Right. So this is basically one of the functionalities that they play. Then they act as source for drinking water, source for drinking water supply. They are one of the storages of carbon, right? Why? Because all these particular plants which grow in this area, they will be able to absorb the amount of carbon dioxide which is present in the atmosphere, because these plants will also carry out the process of photosynthesis. So they will be absorbing them, releasing oxygen as a byproduct, right? So that is where these can also help fight the conditions of climate change. That is why wetland conservation is so significantly a matter of priority. Then act as natural sponges. Natural sponges, as in they absorb excess amount of surface water. Because most of these wetlands, when we talk about the lakes, reservoirs, etc., somewhere or the other, they get in contact with the groundwater. And in many of the cases, you have a layer of soil, a few of the layers of the rocks, and then the groundwater underneath them. So let's suppose a region receives excessive amount of rainfall. Let's suppose. Now, when you have that excessive rainfall, that wetland, that lake, that reservoir will absorb that. Some amount of it, substantial amount of it, will be passed on into groundwater supply as well. Right? Now, what is happening in almost all the urban centers of the country, for example, Hyderabad, Chennai, for that matter, Mumbai, right? Bangalore, one of the worst impacted areas in urban India. Now, what has happened there, because of the politician and the builder nexus, I hope you are aware, everywhere, basically you would have grown up watching movies where in all the movies we have the same theme, that the politician goes into a nexus with a builder and basically they make the entire system corrupt, right? So that system exists in actual life also. So because of this politician builder nexus, in many of these areas, these wetlands, they have been basically grabbed illegally and they have been converted into apartment structures, malls, etc. Now, when you carry out construction over these wetlands, what happens? Then all that excess water won't be stored anymore, right? So in cases when you have excessive rainfall, all that water will run to the streets, will lead to the flooding of the streets, something that you observe in almost all the urban areas of the country, urban flooding. At the same time, now that instead of the wetlands, you have buildings there. Now, in the case of buildings, what do? You basically put that cement piling, the cement base, etc., the RCC, and then you construct the building. So there is no connect with the groundwater. So there is no groundwater recharge also, which is happening in regions such as Bangalore. Not only does Bangalore suffer from flooding every year, let's suppose if it rains for 4 hours, that's it, 4 hours, or not even 4 hours. If it is a heavy rainfall, even 3 hours might do the trick. So there, the entire city gets flooded, the roads, etc., will easily get flooded. But at the same time, Bangalore as an urban area is also suffering from a substantial depletion of the groundwater level. And that is because the wetlands are basically disturbed now, right? So this is basically how the wetlands, if they are maintained, if they are conserved, the urban flooding scenario in the country can be brought to a halt. Okay? Now, then after that, we have the other purposes. So they have a significant biodiversity. They act as natural purifiers where they purify the heavy contaminants. They are a source for drinking water supply, carbon storage. They act as natural sponges of water. So recharge the groundwater also. Recharge the groundwater level. Groundwater levels. Okay. So traps greenhouse gases like methane, etc. That is in carbon storage itself. So that is the aspect that you gain from wetlands. These are the benefits that you ascribe from wetlands. Now, the scientists, the climatologists, ever since 1950s onwards, they have been very concerned about the degradation of these wetlands. Because if you observe a wetland naturally, I'm not talking about a large pond or a lake or a reservoir. I'm talking about these small marshy areas on the sides of the river, etc. Now, when you take a look at it, it appears that as if this region is for no good, right? There's not much benefit out of it. So there had been encroachment of these wetlands which have happened for a substantial long amount of time. The wetlands have been encroached. But as a consequence of that, as a resultant of that, what do you see? You basically observe that all these wetlands, as the construction happens, the ecosystem in that region, the biodiversity in that region suffers over a long time. So the scientists, the climatologists, and the environmentologists had been talking about the conservation of the wetlands ever since the 50s. That is when in 1962, they conducted the first MAR conference, M-A-R, MAR conference. MAR simply stood for marshes, right? Conservation of marshes. For example, in the region around Britain, you had the entire territory being very marshy, very rich in organic compounds. Industrialization basically has degraded them quite significantly and at a very swift pace. So that is even in other areas of low-lying areas of Western Europe also. They have basically destroyed many of these wetlands, and in a cascading manner they have done so. So that MAR conference which was held, there was a consensus which was arrived that, okay, this is an issue. We all need to be working on this issue. And that is when the global consensus was built that we need to conserve these wetlands. In 1971, the first convention to conserve these wetlands was arrived at. It is amongst the first global conventions for any kind of conservation measure. So that is when the first convention was arrived at the Iranian city of Ramsar. And that was for the conservation of these wetlands. And that is what we know as the Ramsar Convention. Ramsar Convention is very simple and direct. and all the various different member countries, they agree to certain basic principles. What are those basic principles? That these wetlands, they are not only very vital for the ecosystem, they are very helpful to the local economy also. For example, since time immemorial, if you recall, in whichever area that you are living in, wherever you observe a very large lake, large reservoir, or a natural marshy region, since time immemorial, the people around that area, they would have carried their livelihood, they would have maintained their livelihood by the activities such as fishing, hunting, right? Now, these wetlands, they provide that economic opportunity, provided you ensure the wise use. So that wise use principle was arrived at. Principle. That utilize it, use the wetlands, but use them sustainably. Extract drinking water from them, but do not render these wetlands dry. They will be able to maintain themselves. The wetlands have been here much before we humans came into existence. Wetlands shall be here much after we humans go out of existence. But then in the meanwhile, as long as we are here, let us not destroy them. Right? They have their natural system of accumulating water through rainfall, etc. In your region also, whichever part of the country you are living in, you would have certain areas within your region where during every rainfall, there is no construction in that area, but in every rainfall, there is a kind of a large lake or a pond gets created. And immediately you will find birds coming into that area, teeming with biodiversity, greenery coming in. And maybe if it is the driest of the month, the water level might go down quite substantially. But even then, at the base of the lake, you will find the soil is muddy, marshy. There also you'll have a lot of biodiversity. So in the Ramsar Convention, this wise use principle was talked about. That use it, but use it sustainably for the betterment of human future. It was found out that wetlands across the world are getting destroyed, and many of them needed an urgent attention. So, how is it basically that you conserve these wetlands? So, for that, you had a system where the wetlands in a particular region were declared as Ramsar sites. Now, how the system would play is, let's suppose in India, we identify that, okay, this lake in Karnataka, this wetland in Karnataka needs conservation. So you will submit that list, recommendation to the Central Wetland Authority. They will take it to the Ramsar, the convention itself. The convention will evaluate that, yes, this needs protection. And does it meet the prerequisite conditions to sustain itself? Or is it already so very destroyed that we cannot bring it back? So then a site is declared as a Ramsar site. Once you declare a wetland as a Ramsar site, not only do you provide a kind of a global identification to it, a global fame to it, you will have tourist footfalls, but at the same time, you provide that kind of an official channel with which you can carry out the conservation that, okay, this is a Ramsar site, this needs to be handled with care, right? Does not mean that if you have a Ramsar site, then all the conservation will happen. For example, in Assam, you have a Ramsar site, that is the Deepor Beel. Now, Deepor Beel was quite significant and also very, very critical for that bird ecosystem, the insect ecosystem in the region of Assam. Now, you know what we did to the Ramsar site of Deepor Beel? We changed it, we converted it into a garbage dumping ground, right? And that is something for which we Indians don't give ourselves enough amount of credit. We should have that much amount of credit. Whenever we see an empty space, we convert into a garbage dump. It might be near our house itself, but if we see an empty space, we throw garbage there. As long as nobody is saying, as long as my house is clean, rest is up to the Sarkar-e-Hind. They will take care of it. So Deepor Beel is an example of how we have basically destroyed the wetland. But nonetheless, Once a region gets identified with a kind of a Ramsar Convention identification, it is declared as a Ramsar site. It involves a greater fund allocation from the national government, state government, also better care, scientific practices of conservation are carried out. And that is because it is in international glare. You cannot destroy it easily, right? Now, even amongst these Ramsar sites, it was basically found out that few of the wetlands are so very critical for the ecosystem, they are so very critical to be conserved, that a new list was prepared for those critical Ramsar sites or those critical wetlands which require conservation. And that is what is known as Montreal's record. So, Montreal's record consists of those vital wetlands which require urgent conservation. Okay? So, now let us take a look at this. So, wetlands, they carry out multiple purposes. One of the other purposes that they do is they protect the coastline by decreasing the effect of tropical cyclone and other calamities such as tsunamis. And why do they do so? How do they do so? So suppose across the coastal area, here you have a kind of a wetland, and in the coastline, particularly those of you living in the region of Kerala, you would have experienced this quite significantly. Near the coastline, you have the beaches, and then on the other side of the beach, one side obviously you will have the sea, on the other side of it, you have shallow water which gets accumulated. And a lot of birds, swans, etc. will be happy there. Right. So this is where many of the times the water tends to accumulate. A small wetland gets created, and here you have the sea. So if let's suppose there's a kind of a storm surge, there is excessive amount of seawater incursion. Now all that water will be absorbed here. Much of that will be absorbed here. There will be some amount maybe which will overflow, but not compared to what would have happened if there would have been no wetland in that region. Right? So they serve as a kind of a natural buffer zone which reduces the impact of these natural calamities. Okay. Now it works as a natural filter, immobilizing potentially hazardous or contaminating chemicals that are dissolved in water. In wetlands, aquatic and terrestrial ecosystems, they frequently coexist. Here, when we talk about the natural filter, understand that this is a very important role that the wetland plays. All the chemicals, etc., they will start getting saturated there, right? There might be sedimentation which happens, they might be carried out by the plants, they might be treated by the plants, broken down by the animals, and the water generated thereby is pure. So for that matter, in the natural ecosystem, they serve as these filters of the ecosystem. Okay? Then Ramsar Convention. It is a convention on wetlands that was signed in 1971 in the Iranian city of Ramsar. And the negotiations of the convention started way back in the 1960s itself with the Mar Conference of the 1962. Mar Conference of 1962 was a precursor to it. And then finally this came into force in 1975, right? So it was started by the different countries and the various different partners of Ramsar. We'll talk about that also. It is not a regulatory regime. It is not as if you are a part of the Ramsar. Any particular region is a part of the Ramsar site. So that it will be the Ramsar Convention's duty to regulate that. No. You need to have your own national laws in order to protect that wetlands. Okay. So here, own national laws are needed for conservation. Okay. Then you had various different amendments which was done in order to strengthen the Ramsar Convention. You don't have to go into the depth of it. What was the Paris Protocol, the Regina Amendment, etc. By the way, here itself, let me basically give a kind of differentiation between a convention and a protocol. Convention is where everybody agrees for a larger goal. right? A larger goal that, okay, we have to conserve the wetlands. That is our goal. How do we do it? In by what year? What is that we aim to do? Which is the process that we will follow? That is not decided in a convention. In a convention, a larger goal is decided. Conservation of wetlands, right? Then convention on climate change. I need to, or we need to conserve the climate. That's it. But when we talk about, let's suppose, the protocol to a convention is basically setting up of the terms, the requirements, the detailing of it, that by when, what do you need to achieve, what is the pathway that you need to follow in order to attain convention, in order to meet the goals of the convention. So that is defined by the protocol. For example, for the conservation of or the protection of ozone layer, you have the Vienna Convention, which talks about the larger aim, the larger goal. But then the goal setting, etc., is done by the Montreal Protocol to the Vienna Convention. Okay. Now, here, when we talk about Montreal's Record, Montreal's Record is a mechanism that was launched in 1990 and is associated with the Ramsar Advisory Mission. It is a register of the list of those Ramsar sites that need urgent attention. That is your Montreal's Record. Now, this is the timeline of it. So basically, you can see you had the Mar Conference calling for an international treaty on wetlands, which was held way back in 1962. Then through the 60s, consensus building was arrived at. Text for the Ramsar Convention was actually negotiated. Then eventually, in 1971, the Ramsar Convention took place. 18 nations agreed to the Convention on Wetlands of International Importance, right? Australia was the first country to accede to the convention, to become a party to the convention. First Ramsar site which was declared was in Australia's Coburg Peninsula. That is the first Ramsar site declared in the world in 1974. Now, UNESCO is the depository, is the member organization. India became the contracting party in 1981. And that is when you had Chilika Lake and Kyoladev National Park. They were declared as Ramsar sites overall. So this is the brief background of the Ramsar Convention. Now you have various different international partners which are associated with the Ramsar Convention. If you take a look at it, these are your international partners. BirdLife International, International Union for Conservation of Nature, IUCN, established in 1948. International Union for Conservation of Nature, right? Then you have Wetlands International, WWF, International Water Management Institute, and Wildfowl and Wetland Trust. Wildfowl, right? Basically depicting the bird life. So birds are so very critical to these wetlands. Now, the convention, the highest decision-making body of any convention, is the Conference of Parties, COP as it is referred to. As we speak, COP for another major event is being held in UAE. Are we aware of that? This is Conference of Parties. Good. COP 28. Follow that closely, right? That is something which will be a part of the current affairs, which will be relevant for the next year's exam. Very relevant for the next year's exam. So Conference of Parties is basically the highest decision-making body for any convention. And in this Conference of Parties, you basically have the members and their representatives. They basically make commitments for conservation ahead into the future. They talk about it, that what is the pathway that the convention should take in order to ensure better conservation methodologies, better conservation techniques going ahead into the future. So that is where COP is helpful. Now, for the Ramsar Convention also, the highest decision-making body is the Conference of Parties. Here, the Conference of Parties for the Ramsar Convention does not meet every year. Thus, this Conference of Parties, that gets together every 2 to 3 years, right? So COP to the convention meets every 3 years. And this is relevant for your prelims, because you can always have a statement-based question where you can have a statement which can be framed that the Conference of Parties for Ramsar Convention is held every year. Is that correct or incorrect? Immediately, you have to arrive at the answer. It is incorrect. Okay. Now, 14th meeting of the COP to the Ramsar Convention was co-hosted by Wuhan, China, and Geneva, Switzerland in November 2022, because Wuhan was still suffering from the COVID, which actually spread out from there. And eventually, those centers became the worst affected. So that is the aspect of Ramsar Convention. Now, in India, we were not very proactive. We have not always been very proactive with that identification that, okay, you need to have these sites as the Ramsar sites. For example, think about Great Britain, right? The region of Britain. Now, there, the number of Ramsar sites in Britain, look at the size of it. I hope we are all aware that it is a very small country. It is a very small island. The number of Ramsar sites in Britain is more than 135, right? Up till 2012, 2013, 2014, year 2012, 2013, we had the number of Ramsar sites in 20s, early 20s. We had around 19, 20, 21, 22. These were the number of Ramsar sites. Now we have 75 Ramsar sites. It is not a mere coincidence. It was basically, you had many more of the wetlands given that identification or that level of protection as per the Ramsar sites in order to celebrate 75 years of Indian independence. So now we have 75 of these Ramsar sites. So these are your Ramsar wetland sites of India. I understand many of you basically have the urge. This is the Deepore Beal that I was talking about, which has been polluted. Many of you have the urge to mug it all up. So this is the list. You are welcome to mug all the things that you want, right? You can have that one-on-one moment with this list, and you can basically start making it as a bucket list item of your life, that one fine day I will learn all the Ramsar sites in India. By that point of time, the government would have declared 5 more different Ramsar sites also. So, but for the rest, I would suggest, please don't mug it all up. So what is the approach? Let's suppose you are appearing for the exams next year. So in this last year, what are the wetlands which have been given that identification or that area of Ramsar sites? So just take a look at those particular wetlands and take a look at the region specific. In which region of the country are those Ramsar sites located? That's it. It has to be a current affairs based study. If you start learning all these 75 wetlands, well, you are doing injustice to some or the other subject out there. In that place, better you will revise a subject like polity once again, and you will be able to secure good marks. So that is why always have the approach of taking a look at it from the portion of current affairs. Okay. Now, then we come to mangroves. Santosh, how it jumped from COP 14 to COP 28? Okay. A genuine question. COP 14 is for Ramsar Convention. COP 28 that we are talking about is a different convention altogether. Open up the news, find the news, or wait for some days. We'll discuss it next week. That is the Conference of Parties number 28. Basically, was held. This is being held for the Convention on Climate Change, UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. So that is the COP number 28. Okay, it is a different convention altogether. Okay. Lakes are also a part of wetlands. Lakes can also be wetland. What are wetlands? Lakes, reservoirs, marshes, bogs, all of them, they come under the category of wetlands. So it is no issue out there. Now then we come to the portion of mangroves. Now mangroves basically are those very specifically adapted plant species which can grow in areas of saturated soil condition. These are those kind of plants. As you can observe that under normal situation, if any region, let's suppose, even your backyard, even your garden, for example, if you flood it with water, immediately the plants will begin to die. They will begin to rot. The root starts rotting in that case. None of the plants are able to grow in submerged condition. But you have certain plant species which are not only able to grow in submerged conditions, they are able to thrive as well, in the sense that they are adapted to growing in those particular submerged water conditions. Those are your mangroves. They generally are found across the coastal areas, across the coastlines. They are generally also found across even the inland areas where you have the marshy lakes and the inland lakes, reservoir systems, etc. They're also on the sideline. For example, as one mentioned about the Vular Lake. Vular Lake in Jammu Kashmir is another region where you will find these mangroves on the sides, right? In order to identify this, those of you who have not been to the coastal areas, at least you would have seen a large water body near your region. Now, in that large water body, what is it that you would have observed? On the sides of that water body, you have a different kind of plants or trees, something that you don't find in the drier regions. Thin stem, multiple of these stems or multiple of these roots coming above water. Then you have a large green foliage. So that is a kind of an associated characteristic, right? So these are those plant species which specialize in saturated soil, saturated as in saturated with water, and in submerged coastal area. This also has got many benefits. We'll talk about the benefits in a separate list altogether. This also has got varying different types of benefits. But in order to grow in these areas, as you can see, it is partially submerged underwater here. This is a coastal area that we are talking about. Here you observe these corals, and here you observe that the mangroves, they are partially submerged in water. So in these coastal areas, the mangroves have to go through certain kind of adaptations in order to survive in these regions. So what are the adaptations? First of all, you'll find pneumatophores, viviparity, salt secreting glands, and also adventitious roots. So what is pneumatophores? Now, the roots, in order to understand these adaptations, understand the basic concept, which you would have read in the science and tech portion also. When we talk about the roots require availability of water as well as oxygen. Air is also required by the roots, the tentacles of the roots. If they don't get the supply of oxygen, they start to rot, they start to die. Now, in the areas where the water covers that ground, how will you have this system where the roots get supply of oxygen? So that is when the roots, they develop a kind of an outgrowth which moves up into the soil and actually stems out into the open air in order to get supply of that. So for example, in a region, let's suppose you have this as the kind of a tree here. Now let's suppose this is the ground surface. This is, let's suppose, covered with some amount of water. Okay. Now here you will have these roots systems. Right. Now many of the roots, they will start developing an outcrop or an outgrowth which emerges above water. This is in order to provide access of oxygen to these roots. These are your pneumatophores. Pneumatophores. So these are basically outgrowth of the roots rather, which emerge above the soil or above the ground surface for access to oxygen. Okay, those are the outgrowths which you find. It is not that everywhere you will find this, but few of the trees, they carry out this kind of an adaptation, this kind of a modification. Then you have viviparity, which is a method of reproductive propagation, where basically under normal circumstances, how is it that the plants reproduce? Generally, you will find that from these plants, maybe the fruit or anything which simply drops on the ground, and there on the ground, the seeds will germinate again. A new plant is born, isn't it? But then what if underneath those plants you have water? If let's suppose any of these fruits, etc., or any of the seeds, they fall on the ground, the water will carry them away. So how will the plants reproduce? So that is why, as I told you, the existence and the survival of species, all the species, is based on the adaptation. That is why these mangroves, they have gone for an adaptation. What is the adaptation that is they have carried out? So here, for example, let's suppose this is the ground surface. Here you have a kind of a mangrove, right? Now, the smaller or the younger ones, they will start growing on the sides of this. The younger ones, what they will do? They will start growing on the sides here. Yeah. Right. They will grow for a substantial length and then they will simply drop on the ground so that they are able to survive. Right. Once they have grown sufficiently, slightly larger, then they will drop on the ground and then they will basically develop the root systems, etc. So that is basically, again, viviparity in order to sustain the young ones, in order to sustain the newer reproduction. Then you have, so this is when newer plants grow on the existing branches. When they grow a bit larger, they drop on the ground and then survive. Then, majority of these mangroves, they grow in the areas where the water is very salty, very saline. Generally, for the trees, do you give salty water? You provide fresh water. Why? Why is it that the trees will grow only in the fresh water? That is because within the trees, through the network of xylem and phloem, from the roots, as the water is pushed up into the body of the tree, as the water is basically then extracted, is being made use of, then where does that water go? Water basically goes to the leaves, and through the pores in these leaves, the water basically moves away, evaporates, or what is referred to as transpiration. Water is lost into the atmosphere by the leaves of these plants. But if you have salty water, saline water, then during the process of transpiration, what will happen? Water is lost through the pores of these leaves, isn't it? All the leaf systems that you have will have these pores through which water is lost into the atmosphere. Right? But if you have saline water which is coming through, then what will happen? Only the water portion of it will get evaporated. The salt will accumulate here. jamming these pores. Once the pores are jammed, then the leaves, they start to die. That is why the leaves of mangroves have a different and a separate salt secreting gland, generally in the underbelly, whereby that excess salt or the saline water has got those salts. So those salts, they accumulate on the underbelly of the leaves. When the wind blows, whenever there is a slightest ruffling of the trees, all that salt then falls on the ground, on the water, and is absorbed by the water again, so that the salt accumulation does not happen on the leaves. Okay, so to ensure that salt accumulation is not observed on the leaves. Right. So that is why they have these glands generally on the underside, the underbelly of the leaf structure, where the water will be lost due to evaporation above and the salts will start getting secreted. Then you have the adventitious roots. Adventitious roots you find in other type of plants also. This is when you will find that the root system overall. Now here, these are the plants which are present in standing water in the coastal areas. Many of the times they have to withstand the wrath of the waves also. So that is why, in general, if you observe these stems, the branches, they are very, very thin and they have a large foliage. Right? Foliage as in the green growth is very large. So in many of the plants, you will observe what is that due to this very thin branches, if you have a thick foliage to support, let's suppose this is the thick foliage that the plants have to basically support. Now there, the roots will have the outgrowth coming from here itself. Okay. So you will have multiple such systems, multiple of them emerging from the main branches, and the roots will be having some portion up in the air. For example, look at this area. I hope you are able to look at this. So this is where, if you notice it carefully, if you notice, I'll rub all of the other portions. You will observe that the root system in itself has come airborne, has attached to the branches in order to support the plant and also provide availability of oxygen or air to the root system. So here, to support plants, the plant in standing water and also provide access to air. It is very different from pneumatophores. What are pneumatophores? Pneumatophores are small outgrowths that the roots have which emerge above the ground. That's it. When we talk about the adventitious or the stilt root system, here you will have that kind of a root which attaches itself with the main stem, with the main trunk. It will have multiple different branches for its own as well. So all this will be your very detailed root system, which will support the plant, which will also be attached to the plant and will provide oxygen. So very different from pneumatophores. So these are the various adaptations that the mangroves go through. Now the mangroves, they provide various different ecosystem services. Ecosystem services refer to the benefits provided by any particular portion or component of the ecosystem. They are very, very useful. The green foliage, the leaves, they store a lot of carbon dioxide. A lot of carbon dioxide from the air is sequestered, is stored by them. Now, here they provide livelihood opportunities, close to around 120 million people living there near the region of mangroves all across the world. Right? For example, in India, one or in the region of India and Bangladesh, you have an kind of a region which is dominated by the mangrove tree, particularly the Sundari tree. Sundari tree. Right? And after this name, you have Sundari tree is a mangrove. This is a name of a mangrove. After this, you have the name Sundarbans, a forest of the Sundari trees. So you have a lot of people living in that area because this is a region where you will have a lot of ecological or natural produce which can sustain life, right? Which can provide economic incentives. Now, here you will find basically that they store significant amount of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. They support a lot of fisheries as well. Why? Because, believe it or not, here in this region, near the in the submerged portion, which is covered in water, here these mangroves, they will continue to produce some or the other organic matter, and that organic component will be released into the water body. Now the fishes, they will come immediately to feed on that organic matter. So the region around mangroves is particularly rich for the presence of organic matter, and that is where the fisheries also are very rewarding. Tourism aspect of it obviously is one of the benefits. Then water filtration. So there also, basically, you will observe that the vivid root system, the very intense and widespread and an extensive root system, that has also got the ability to trap the contaminants within it, and then only the cleaner, lighter water is left out. And the roots, they hold those contaminants. They keep on holding those contaminants. Then these mangroves, they also provide a kind of a buffer zone against the various different events of storm surge, cyclones, etc. So they provide a kind of a barrier against these events of nature, and they also end up preventing coastline erosion. The coastal erosion, etc., which is carried out, that is also prevented by the mangroves. A region in India is in news recently in the past month or so, and quite prominently for that matter, because the coastline is getting eroded. The sea is coming inwards, and that is the region of Sriharikota, where you have the satellite launch station of the country, the satellite launching base of the country, that is in Sriharikota, the island of Sriharikota. I hope we are aware. Now, that Sriharikota is experiencing a kind of a tremendous amount of coastal erosion, where the seawater is eking out some amount of the landmass year after year. Now, if the mangrove population is quite dominant, they will not allow the coastal erosion to happen beyond a point, right? They will hold the soil particularly in its point. Then the mangroves, they also provide wood for the fuel. But then these mangroves, they suffer from various different threats on a day-to-day basis, because of which their population has been declining and has been decreasing at a very tremendous and a fast rate. So here, the threats that they face, first of all, because they offer wood, so logging or wood cutting is a very prominent economic activity. Then after that, extension of agriculture. Many of these regions of mangroves, they are cleared every year in order to plant crops. Now the crops, let's suppose you grow wheat or rice in that region, they will never have the same benefit. They will never be able to store that much amount of carbon dioxide. They will never allow the biodiversity to grow in that region. So they will never have any of the benefits that the natural mangrove ecosystem will do. But then that particular portion of agricultural extension or extension of the area to be brought under agriculture, this is the most dominant reason across the world for widespread deforestation across the world, be it in India, be it in Indonesia, be it in the region of Brazil, Amazon rainforest, be it in Africa. Anywhere that you go for or you observe deforestation to be happening, one of the prime reason is people want to irrigate or cultivate that land. So that also, as you can see, that cultivation of paddies has led to 88% of the mangrove loss in the region of Myanmar. Then aquaculture. If you carry out any kind of aquaculture, etc., unsustainably, where you basically cut down the trees, etc., that also creates a loss of mangroves. Pollution, one of our favorite pastimes, we pollute the region. So basically, that also is destructive. Many of the times, the coastal pollution, plastic waste dumping happens. Many of the times, the oil pollution or the oil film gets spread over. Then the coastal development, right? So infrastructure building activities, that is also leading to the loss of mangroves. Okay, I see few of you are confused between mangroves and wetlands. How many of us are getting confused in mangroves and wetlands? Is there any confusion? Okay, it is. Hmm. So that means many of you have not seen a mangrove in your life, which is very, very surprising. But let's see. Don't worry. Here, understand this. If we talk about a region like this, those of you who belong to the coastal states or who have never been to a coastal state, ideally, those of you who have never been to a coastal area, you should go to a coastal area. The unique diversity in that region is something unparalleled. So this is where, in some region, you will have water accumulated in the form of a lake, in the form of a pond. Here you will have small plants which will grow, small plants which will grow. Maybe the plants might not grow at all, but maybe small plants will grow. This is your what? This is the region of your wetland. Okay. Now, in an area, let's suppose generally across the coastlines, you will come across the fact here, let's suppose you have the water body. Let's suppose here you have the water body. So you will find many of the trees growing in this area. In the coastal environment. These are your mangroves. The trees are your mangroves. Okay? Mangroves are trees. Wetland is a space, is the region, right? For example, if I have to give the analogy, then evergreen or rainforest is a kind of a tree. Desert is a space, isn't it? Desert is a condition on the ground, but the trees, they are very different. So that is where mangroves are basically the trees. Is that understood now? Bhagya, Ashish, Chitri, Vani, is that understood? Chandrasekhar, right? Good. Now, and don't be scared to ask these questions. Get your doubts resolved. Don't worry about that. Okay. Yes, Pichavaram in Tamil Nadu is an example of that. Mangroves are dominant in eastern coast compared to western coast. In western coast, generally the mangroves, you will find the mangroves only where the coastline is not very conducive, where you have the hilly coastline, there you will have some issue. But otherwise, you will have that mangroves in the western coast also. In eastern coast, you have a kind of a flattest landmass, so that is why mangroves are very dominant. But when you come to the region of Kerala, God's own country, that is a different matter altogether. It is like if you basically take a view from above, Sometimes, if you get an opportunity to do that, you will find lush green mangrove vegetation spread all across the coastline of Kerala. And in fact, the mangrove tourism is one of the new arising areas of or new arising avenue of income generation in Kerala. And this is something which is done in Sri Lanka also. Sri Lanka also thrives on mangrove tourism. They will take you in the boats through these backwaters, etc., into the darkest of the mangrove vegetation, because the mangroves are so very dense, not much light is able to penetrate through. So these are generally darker in appearance, right? So I'll show you the images if possible. Okay. Now, then, in order to conserve this mangrove, this year's budget, you had the Misty scheme which was announced. And this was announced in this year for the budget of 23-24. So Misty basically stands for Mangrove Initiative for Shoreline Habitat and Tangible Income. That is what is your Misty scheme. Now, this is to conserve the region, protect the areas under mangrove vegetation, and also in order to provide sustainable livelihood opportunities to the people living in the nearby areas. So comprehensively explore the possible area for development of mangroves, covering approximately 540 square kilometer, spreading across 11 states and 2 union territories in the 5 years commencing 2023-24 onwards. Right? Now, here basically, what will this scheme envisage? Sharing of best practices for conservation measures, management practices, mobilization through public-private partnership, that will be a key part of it. Now, this was announced in 2023-24 budget along with another scheme, and that was for the conservation of wetlands. For wetlands also, the government had announced a scheme. Are we aware of the name of the scheme by any chance? No? Okay. So I'll write it here. I'll write that here. Very good, Vaishnav. So you had the Amrit Puja, correct? Amrit Dharohar scheme. This was for announced in the budget of 2023-24, right? And this is for conservation of wetlands, sustaining the livelihood of the local population also, of local population. Right? That is your for the conservation of wetlands. Okay? Now, after this, when we talk about the mangroves, we have talked about the fact that they have, because the density of leaves is quite significant, they have an increased propensity for protecting and basically taking in more amount of carbon dioxide, right? So they help in fighting climate change. That is where you have an international alliance which has been arrived at. That is the Mangrove Alliance for Climate. The Mangrove Alliance for Climate. Now, this is done to increase the area under mangrove vegetation globally. Okay, right? Help fight climate change by ensuring greater carbon storage. Carbon storage, support the coastal ecosystem and also the livelihoods of local community. Right. This has been launched by UAE and Indonesia. Indonesia has got so many different islands, hundreds and thousands of islands, small, large, medium size in nature, that in those coastal areas, you will always find a greater growth of the mangrove population. Large amount of growth of mangrove population will be observed there. So that is where it has been launched by UAE and Indonesia. India is a member of this. Indonesia, in fact, in itself, accounts for almost 20% of the mangrove vegetation across the world. Accounts for almost 20% of mangrove vegetation in the world. The diversity of the type of mangrove trees, etc., is also very high. This has been arrived at later last year in 2022 after the Conference of Parties for Convention on Climate Change, the COP27, was held in the Egyptian resort town of Sharm el-Sheikh. After that, you had this Mangrove Alliance for Climate, which was arrived at. This was thought to be a kind of a precursor by UAE in order to prepare for the Conference of Parties number 28, which it is holding. Right, the Prime Minister is also going to be in attendance there. Now, then we come to the marine aquatic system, and there we talk about the diversity in the marine areas. Now, when we talk about the marine regions, basically, the shallower portions, they are known as the region of the continental shelf. Okay, you need a break. Okay, fair enough. So we take a break, and we'll be back after 15 minutes. Break because of the demand. That is why break. So democratic setup, it is there. So basically, okay, fair enough. Let's take a break, and then we'll be back for the marine aquatic systems. We will continue after that. We'll talk about the corals, etc. So we take a break, take a 15 minutes break, be back. Places where the life germinated across the planet. The genesis of life, the birth of life, happened in the marine areas. But when we say marine areas or the regions under water body, it is not a kind of a uniform region. It is not as if every region is one and the same here. So you have the region of the continental shelf, and in these continental shelves, sunlight is available, right? You have the availability of sunlight. When you have the availability of sunlight, that means what? Plants will be able to grow, right? Growth of plants. And when you have growth of plants, that basically brings life or larger biodiversity. So these continental shelf areas, they are heavily populated with life. And I have told this before as well, that when we consider the continental shelves, they end up representing only around 8 to 10% of the entire oceanic area. these continental shelves, they end up representing only 8 to 10% of the aerial coverage of the entire oceanic area. But they house more than 90% of the biodiversity of the oceans. More than 90% of the biodiversity of the oceans is included in the continental shelf. The genesis of life in itself happened in these regions of continental shelves. It is only after 100 million years or so later, in fact, billions of years later, rather, and quite recently for that matter, around 500, 600 million years back, you had few of the species. In order to escape the predators from the region of the shelf, they started moving into the depths. And these species, for example, jellyfish, they started moving into the depths. They were followed by the other species also. Whenever life on the land, or whenever the conditions of land have become very violent, intolerable, violent not in form of wars, etc., in terms of the geophysical events, in terms of volcanic eruptions, in terms of climate change, etc., life has always migrated into the deeper waters. Now, when we talk about the waters in depth, at the base of the ocean floor, which is at a depth of maybe around 5 kilometers or 6 kilometers from the surface, at these depths, availability of sunlight is not there. No sunlight at all. So that is what is referred to as the benthic zone. Now, for a long period of time, we all thought about it, and the perception was that at this particular bottom of the ocean, there would not have been any life. There would not be any life at all. Because the thought process was very simple. Sunlight is not available. How can plants exist? If the plants cannot exist, where will the food come from? It was only quite recently in the past 50, 60 years where various different ocean explorations have indicated that not only is there life, you have very varied forms of life. We have not managed to explore the entirety of the ocean bottom till now. For that matter, we have much better resolution images for the Mars, for the moon, as compared to the ocean bottoms. That is why sometimes, if ever you have taken a deeper notice of the world map, in these waters, sometimes you will find a kind of an abnormal kink, which is indicated. Means that map is not very clear. But nonetheless, the species living at the bottom, they are what are also referred to as benthos. Now, these benthos, they have evolved in such a way that they are able to live in very dark conditions, absolute pitch darkness. You have certain species of squids, right? One of the early predators. You have jellyfish. You have certain species of shrimp, sharks, fishes, all of them. Here you will find species of plankton, right, who provide bioluminescence. Bioluminescence is a common feature amongst many of the species there. What is bioluminescence? Whereby their bodily activities, they are able to produce chemicals which produce light, right? You would have seen that kind of a firefly moving around. During the night time, they glow. So that is bioluminescence. So at these depth of the oceans, you have certain planktons which exhibit bioluminescence. So this is used by the species to hunt also. For example, let's suppose you have any of the species which is moving or which indicates a significant amount of movement near the ocean floor. All the planktons immediately will start lighting up in that bluish white light. So for the predator, it is an easy indicator that this is where the prey is. So that is one kind of adaptation. Almost all the species, all the benthic species that you will come across, they will have very large eyes, which have evolved over the period of millions of years. Millions of years of evolution has led to that, where the eyes almost bulge out, the eye socket bulges out of the body, so as to give them a clear view in that absolute darkness. Many of the species of fishes that you find, many of the different species that you find, they have a kind of a gelatinous jelly-like body. so as to withstand the high pressure without crumbling, right? So that is the adaptation that these benthic species they undergo. So squids, certain kinds of shrimps, then for example oarfish is an example of that benthic species. You have certain varieties of sharks also which are found in these greater depths, right? So these are your examples. Anglerfish is also one of those. Good. So you have oarfish, and then you have squids, jellyfish, etc. Orcas, they don't live in the bottom of the ocean, my dear friend Santosh. Orcas, or the killer whales, they are named as killer whales. Generally, the whale species that you have, sperm whale, humpback whale, or the blue whale, all of them, they will eat smaller fishes in large amount. Orcas, orcas are such species who hunt for pleasure many of the times. Many of the times these orcas, they basically, you won't find a lot of these orcas in the shelf area, but not exactly at the benthic zone also. These orcas, they end up traveling for many hundreds of kilometers, and you will find that they will kill a blue whale, not eat it after that, because they want to hunt. And orcas are amongst the few species of whales who can even hunt the terrestrial species. Many of those amphibians also, many of the seals, many of the cubs of the smaller polar bear, they can also be hunted by the orcas. So they are very evolved, but the most, in a way, well suited natural predator of the high seas, if you think about it, where the body system has been evolving for millions of years to give them that edge in hunting, that is the sharks, right? And it is a kind of a different matter altogether that these sharks would never have been in existence had that second or the third mass extinction not happened, where all the marine species, suddenly many of the marine species, due to eutrophication, they died. You had one of those predator or the previous ancestors of sharks who were so very large that they could simply consume the sharks, break them into two, and they would be the dominant ones. But due to that eutrophication, those got extinct, and the sharks, they got a chance to survive. But orcas, what they lack in their that natural body evolution for hunting, the orcas make up for it in terms of their intelligence and teamwork, right? And all these species, if you observe their hunting mechanism, that is something which the nature has honed in for multiple millions of years. Just like how you go for playing any sport, you need practice. After many years of practice, you might end up in a professional level. Imagine, the species have been doing that practice for millions of years. They have evolved their body structure accordingly, right? Now, for decomposition required oxygen, then what about the dead thing inside benthos? How? So dissolved oxygen is present here also. Dissolved oxygen is present here also. So the dissolved oxygen by the marine plants which is produced, that will be supplied and circulated in the entirety of the water. And also understand, from the air-water interface also oxygen is basically absorbed by water. Okay, so that dissolved oxygen, for example, here also you will have the planktons, the phytoplanktons, the small microbial species of algae who utilize sunlight to produce energy. Now, these planktons have been producing oxygen for so many hundreds of millions of years that they have populated the atmosphere with oxygen. So that will be the case with the oceans also, right? Yes, Devansh, our planet documentary beautifully portrayed marine aquatic system. Yes. Hunt for pleasure means that you hunt a species, but you don't consume it. You simply are hunting to kill that species. That's it. And you don't want to have that food out of it. Okay. And Aditya, in Discovery Channel, the huge amount of vegetation that we see is belonging to the region of continental shelf. Yes. For example, in Discovery Channel, you will observe the kelp forest. Yes, Divya, you have raised that issue of kelp forest. So you have the kelp, which grows in the region of the temperate areas, the temperate oceans rather. That is the northwestern portion of Atlantic, etc. If not able to identify it, I'm sure many of you would have seen Harry Potter movies, where you observe underwater forest kind of a system. That is your kelp. So those are the things which are frequently shown in that Discovery Channel, which grows in the continental shelves. Kelps are basically the kind of algal growth, right? They can grow for many meters altogether, and they sequester a lot of minerals. They produce a lot of minerals. Many of these kelps, they are source of phosphorus also, right? So that is basically in the shelf region. Only documentary which is better than Our Planet 1 is Our Planet 2. There is another very good documentary which has come into place, Life on Planet Earth. There are multiple such documentaries, and basically all the documentaries of David Attenborough, or what is indicated by BBC Earth, all of those documentaries are very nice. And Man versus Wild is a kind of a documentary which is for pleasure, which basically will help you have some amount of fun, but it won't give you much idea about the process of evolution, adaptation, etc. Okay, and its production rate of oxygen is very minimal. Whose production rate? Kelp. Yes, it is. It does not produce. But see, production rate of oxygen depends upon the rate of photosynthesis which is carried out. Okay. What to observe in these documentaries? Simply observe that how the planet has got various different areas of different characteristics. All the different areas have different species of animals and plants. All of them are in struggle for survival, right? Almost all of them are continuously struggling in order to survive. So that is something that you need to notice out of that. So here, then we come to the marine aquatic systems. Temperature, salinity, depth, current, substrata, and tides near the ocean's edge all contribute to the variation in terms of the marine ecology. Now, the aquatic system is split into photic and aphotic zone. Photic zone, up till which the light penetrates. Aphotic zone, which remains in perpetual darkness. And the marine environment accounts for majority of the Earth's surface. That is something you would be already aware of. Now we come to the coral reefs. Now, what are coral reefs? So basically, these are, when we say reef, it is a kind of a continuous structure, a very large structure made out of multiple of these individual corals. And individual corals, what we refer to as coral polyp. Coral polyp. Okay. This is actually an animal. This is a species of an animal. This is not like a plant. This is an animal. Many of these coral polyps together, they make up the reef systems. Now, they are very, very vital for the marine aquatic ecosystem. Okay. Now, these coral reefs, they are also known as the tropical rainforest. Also known as the tropical rainforest of marine systems. Why? Why? Because here, due to the symbiotic relationship with the algae, symbiotic means mutually beneficial. Symbiotic relation with algae, that is zooxanthellae. Xanthellae, they are able to produce oxygen. Which is very vital. The presence of oxygen in the oceans, that is very, very vital. As we will see further in module 6, many of the species, they went extinct because of the lack of oxygen in the water. As late as, or as recently as 95 million years ago, you had a sudden spate of, or a sudden spurt in volcanic events all across the planet, even underwater, due to which the proportion of carbon dioxide increased and the proportion of oxygen in the water plummeted. Many of the larger species, few of them as large as a blue whale, and few of them predicted to be much larger than the blue whale as well, many of them, they virtually went extinct because of lack of oxygen. So oxygen, the availability of oxygen, is very important in shaping the life. If the amount or the availability of oxygen in the atmosphere, let's suppose in the outside atmosphere, or even for that matter in the water body, if it would have been very limited, we would never have had larger animals or species into existence. In fact, when the first kind of the arthropods, or the what you associate with a kind of a caterpillar or a worm-like structure, when first of these species they came on land, the land had so much amount of oxygen because of the growth of the plants. They could grow larger and larger and larger, right? They could grow up to 3 to 4 meters long. Even in the marine environment, the availability of oxygen, sudden availability and increase in oxygen because of the growth of planktons, that allowed for the species such as the blue whales to grow larger, their body structures grew larger. Even though blue whales, they carry out their respiration through the air itself, through the air. So that is why they come up and they take in that oxygen, and then again they go down. But many other species, you will find, they have been able to grow large because of the availability of dissolved oxygen in the water. Now, after this, another particular influence that they give, why they are always said to be similar to the tropical evergreen forest here, is basically provide food and shelter to a very wide biodiversity. Okay, so these are made up of individual coral polyps. Now these corals, they synthesize calcium and carbonate, calcium ions, carbonate ions, which are present in the oceanic water. They synthesize that and they build a very hard, stony, whitish calcium carbonate exoskeleton around them. And they are fixed to the seafloor. They cannot move, right? If we consider about those species, if we talk about those species who have the ability to move, they have a different ability to search for food because they can move and search for food. But let's suppose you talk about the corals, sea anemones, for example. Now they are fixed to the seafloor, so they cannot move. So basically, what these species will do, they will rely on things floating by, a small objects or a small organic matter floating by, and that is where what will be caught by the tentacles, and the tentacles will ingest it, again wait for another small object floating by, they will again ingest it. So that is how they carry out the requirement of food. But then obviously it is not always enough. So that is why they allow that, they create that condition of that calcium carbonate exoskeleton. There you have the presence of nutrients such as calcium carbonate, sulfate sometimes also, where the algal species starts to grow around them. And that algae provides the very unique coloration pattern: purple, green, yellow, red. All that coloration that you see for the corals is provided by the zooxanthellae population. And that is where the zooxanthellae population gets a platform to grow. The corals provide them with a platform. And then they carry out the process of photosynthesis, but because they need the access to sunlight, they carry out the process of photosynthesis. They produce enough food which the corals can also consume, and enough for the surrounding as well. That is why the zooxanthellae population is very vital for the survivability of these corals. However, not all the corals have the presence of this zooxanthellae. Not all of them. Generally, when we talk about corals, broadly, the broader classification of it can be done into warm water, water corals, and cold water corals. This is found near the surface. Okay, has got a zooxanthellae. And here, the cold water corals found at depth do not have zooxanthellae. Example of this are black corals. Okay. Now, across the world, amongst the corals that we have basically managed to discover, mostly we have managed to look into the warm water corals. And the deeper water corals, basically, they represent a kind of a stony structure. They are found at these benthic zones also many of the times. So much research has not been carried out in those particular areas. And it might be possible that as, let's suppose 10 years from now, let's suppose 20 years from now, when finally we achieve a state where we have been able to map out the entirety of the ocean floor, we have been able to explore the ocean floor, we might find certain properties which are very different as compared to the warm water corals, right? But mostly these warm water corals, they are the ones which provide, they will be present in the region of continental shelf. Why? Because for the zooxanthellae to manufacture food, what do they need? They need sunlight. And sunlight will be available mostly in the region of shelf area. Mostly found in the regions of continental shelf. That is why the zooxanthellae population is very, very vital for not only the survivability of the corals, but the support system to the entire life around it. Now, sometimes, due to certain adverse situations, maybe such as the marine temperature suddenly rises. You would have heard about the condition of a marine heat wave, haven't you? Where the temperature of the seawater for a brief duration rises by 3 to 4 degrees Celsius in a certain small area. So, whenever you have such adverse conditions coming, the zooxanthellae population starts dying off. And when they start to die off, they basically leave that coral. So that vividly beautiful colored pattern that you had observed, once the zooxanthellae leaves it all that you have left behind is a stony whitish appearance of a coral. That is what we refer to as the event of coral bleaching. So when that coral bleaching happens, the zooxanthellae population leaves those corals. So the entire biodiversity which was supported by that entire biodiversity is impacted. That is why coral bleaching is such a prominent threat to the marine ecosystem that needs to be taken care of. Now, here, this is what an individual coral polyp looks like. This is your coral polyp. Coral polyp. So here, observe that the body structure is very simple. You have many of these tentacles around the body structure, and on these tentacles you have these the algal species. They dominate here. It is a mutually beneficial relationship that they enter into, and that is where you have the zooxanthellae. Okay, so The corals, they synthesize the calcium and the carbonate ions present in the seawater to build that very stony, whitish calcium carbonate exoskeleton around them. And look at the digestive system, how simple it is. So the tentacles, they frequently have a kind of an activity. If let's suppose you have the orifice or the opening in the center, all around it you have the tentacles. If you observe it for some time, the tentacles have kind of a rhythmic motion. They stick out to trap any moving part, then automatically after some time this will fold, it will ingest anything it has trapped, then maybe this will fold, it will ingest anything which has trapped, then this will fold, again this will open up, then this will fold, then this will fold. So they keep on feeding themselves, but obviously the amount of food produced is not very high. That is why the food produced by zooxanthellae is utilized by the corals also. Okay, now the conditions for the warm water corals. What are the conditions required for the warm water corals? Coral polyp is an animal. Okay, the coral polyp is an animal, and it is surrounded by algal species. So the conditions required for warm water, so temperature. Why it's considered an animal? Because it is an animal with a well-developed digestive system and so on. That is why. So temperature consistent around 24 to 26 degrees Celsius. Availability of sunlight. Then clear, saline water. Okay, these are the conditions required. So that is why in muddy water conditions, when the water turns out to be very muddy, for example, these corals, they will start to get bleached, or the zooxanthellae population leaves. Because when you create a turbulent water or when you come across a muddy water, means what? Accessibility or the penetration of sunlight is very limited. You don't have enough sunlight which is provided through, which passes through. Okay, now this is how the corals basically grow. This is something that you would have covered in the geography class also, where let's suppose you have the set of corals which grow here. Now after they die, they will leave behind the calcium carbonate exoskeleton, right? And the next set of corals, the next generation of corals will grow on top of them, utilize the existing calcium carbonate exoskeleton. Then when they die, they will leave behind that, and then the next corals will grow on top of that. That is how, one on top of other, these corals, they continue to grow. Few of these corals, for example, few of the black corals, they have a life duration or a lifespan of more than 1,000 years also. But few of them, they exist for few decades or few centuries. So they have, depending upon the type of species, you have a kind of a varying life expectancy for them. Okay, now as I told you, when the harsh conditions prevail, the zooxanthellae population, which was bound to the corals, the zooxanthellae population starts leaving the corals. After all, every species out there in the nature, every species wants to survive. No species does anything purely for the benefit of others. Any species which is doing any event, even though if it is benefiting others, that is to ensure their own survivability. Lichens, which are basically the symbiotic relationship between an algae and a fungi, now they were the first ones to colonize the land across the planet. The only reason they were in a symbiotic relationship was because algae alone could not survive on the land, and fungi alone at that point of time could not even survive. So that is why they came together. Here also, in the warm water corals, the zooxanthellae, many of the times they require that platform where sunlight is consistently available, nutrients are consistently available, and the corals require the food. That is why they come together. Never does any species do anything for the larger benefit of the planet. No, it is a constant race to survive, constant race to reproduce, and eventually modify themselves, adapt themselves. Maybe if suppose the conditions on the planet become very worse, right? You have many people who worry about the fact that there might be a nuclear war and the life on the planet might come to an end. Fair enough. But that won't be the end of life of planet Earth. There will be new forms of life which would germinate. There would be new forms of evolution which would happen. Now, when the conditions turn very harsh, where let's suppose suddenly the temperature changes in conditions of sudden temperature change, sudden temperature change. Let's suppose excessive pollution. Let's suppose a disease, spread of a disease, a kind of a fungal infection or a bacterial infection in this area, right? Or let's suppose tourism or fishing activities like bottom trawling. Now, any of these events, if they unravel, if they unfold, first of all, few of the algae, they start to die. Their productivity reduces. Because remember what we had discussed in the first class. When we talk about the marine species, their tolerance for temperature variation is very less. Because historically, they have survived in a region where the temperature has not changed quite drastically. So the marine species, they have lesser thermal variation tolerance. So if there's a sudden departure, the species either will move to a different place or they start to die. Now the corals, they are fixed to the ground surface. They cannot move. But the zooxanthellae, immediately as soon as the productivity starts to decline, few of those, they start to die. The zooxanthellae, they move off. And if let's suppose the conditions in that area revert back to normalcy within 45 to 60 days, the zooxanthellae population will come back. They will again thrive over that coral. But if let's suppose the condition continues to worsen, and if let's suppose the condition remains like this for many, many days and months together, the zooxanthellae never comes back. And the coral is left by itself as a stony whitish structure, right? That is why this phenomena is known as bleaching. When you carry out bleaching, what do? You provide a kind of a whitening event, isn't it? So this is the event which creates the corals returning back to their normal state of stony white appearance without zooxanthellae. The corals are not able to survive this. So if the conditions don't revert back to normalcy, the corals, they start to die off. That is why if the coral bleaching is not restored, many species of corals can be lost. For example, in the region of the Great Barrier Reef of the northeastern coastline of Australia, you have one of the largest reef structures across the world is the Great Barrier Reef, visible even from space, around 2,500 miles long. Now that Great Barrier Reef basically has experienced such significant die-offs of the corals because of the marine heat wave, which occurs very frequently in that area. Now, many of the corals across various different parts, they have been degraded, they have been wasted, they have died, they have been killed, right, because of fishing activities, etc. Now, that is why the attention of the global botanists and ecologists and the environmentalists as of now is how to restore these corals back again. And for that, they basically use various different technologies. One of the technologies that they use is the cryomesh. Cryomesh is basically a newer tech which has come, which basically it is not so new that it has come recently. It was present in news headlines since early this year itself. So cryomesh technology is where you freeze the coral larvae or the coral species, the genetics in their larval stage itself, right? You freeze them so that you have that genetic diversity present. So that if you want to reproduce them or reintroduce them after the situations turn to normal, you can ensure a species diversity. Because please understand, just conserving a species is not important. It is important to conserve the diversity of species. For example, even in the case of any corals, even in the case of, for example, any of the animals, you have that genetic diversity which is required, which is very much needed for the process of conservation. If the diversity amongst that species is lacking, the species won't be able to survive. So cryomesh is one of those available techs, one of those available technologies, which is used to freeze the coral larvae to ensure that genetic diversity is maintained, so that we'll introduce it later on. You have another thing, that is what is referred to as the biorock technology, right? So you have the biorock technology. So biorock is what? Where artificially, with the passage of small amounts of electric charge, you ensure the formation of a rock system, right, of calcium carbonate. Because it is understood that the corals, they are able to synthesize that calcium carbonate from all around, and based on that calcium carbonate only will you have the population of zooxanthellae coming there, isn't it? So what is done in that biorock tech is basically a specific wired mesh like structure is introduced in the water. A small electric charge is passed through. Electrolysis. Electrolysis happens, which leads to accumulation of CaCO3 on that mesh. This resembles the natural coral platform, then degraded or this is introduced in regions where significant coral degradation has been experienced, witnessed, and then species of corals are introduced into this mesh like CaCO3 formation, the corals grow along with vital zooxanthellae. Right? So the structure that you have, if you have to think about, the structure is very, very simple in the sense that this will be the kind of a structure and it will have the wired mesh around, right? Of certain specific elements, they will basically create this structure. So of certain specific elements, you will have this kind of a mesh-like system. Okay, so here you have that kind of a mesh. Now what do? You basically introduce this into the area, into the region where there has been substantial amount of coral degradation, or maybe the coral death has happened in mass because of the bleaching activities. You pass a very small, minute amount of charge through this. Calcium ions are present in the seawater. Along with that, you have carbonate ions, which are also present in the seawater. So electrolysis happens. This calcium and carbonate, they basically start accumulating here on the sides. Here, right? They start accumulating on the sides here, on all of them. So it constitutes a kind of a rock-like substrate. And then you introduce the corals on top of this. The corals will reproduce. The corals will thrive. And that can be a restoration of the entire ecosystem. Now, if you do this in a region where, let's suppose, the corals have completely been removed, or due to climate change, the corals have completely died off, and then you introduce this, can this be thought to be an example of subsea or secondary succession? Can we think about this? If in an area the complete desertification underwater has happened, can we think about this to be a condition of a secondary succession? Yes or no? Yes. Very good. Now, the rate of succession is faster in the case of secondary succession or a primary succession? It is faster in secondary succession. That is why in a very short time span, in a very short window, you'll find the region not only repopulated with corals, but thriving with that. And that will then soon spread over to the other areas. The corals will make the entire region their home. So this is the biorock tech, which is used in order to restore the area where there has been such significant amount of degradation of the corals witnessed. Okay. Basically, I can go on and give a lecture on the corals and the coral reefs for another 1.5 or 2 hours. But again, I would be doing a great disservice to you because not that much is required for your examination. For your examination, you should be aware what these corals are, where are they present, and keep your eyes and ears open for the newer tech and the newer set of information. It might not be asked immediately, it might be asked sometime next or next year or year after that. For example, biorock tech was asked in UPSC prelims after it was in discussion. Almost biorock technology has been in discussion for the restoration of degraded coral reefs for since 2017-18. Since that point of time, we have been covering that portion in the portion of the current affairs. It was asked only last year. Right. So it is not immediately going to be asked. It might not immediately be asked, but it will be asked definitely sometime in the future. Can corals come for in mains? Absolutely yes. Why not? Absolutely yes. Vivek, my dear friend, you have a kind of a question which is persistent for a very, very long period of time. And I don't know why that question is so very prickly for you. The question is, why stomach appears to be so large in the corals? So, see, that thing that you see in the digestive tract, it is a very simplistic image, my dear friend. This is the entire completion of the entire digestive system of these corals. It is not only a stomach, it also ensures digestion, extraction. So, all in our body, you have the stomach, you have the intestines also. All of that role is played by this digestive tract opening. Okay, that is why this is larger. Cryopreservation or the cryomesh tech, Shalu, is basically a newer tech which has been arrived at in Australia, where the genetic diversity of corals is sought to be protected and preserved. How? By preserving the coral's larvae and freezing them at very low temperature. And if, let's suppose, there has been a loss of coral due to marine heat wave or any other reason which has been experienced, then those larval stages will be reintroduced into those areas impacted and the corals can thrive. The very reason why we have a seed bank, the world has a specific seed bank, seed vault, right? Where is that seed vault for the world located? Are we aware of that? Where is the global seed bank located? Global seed bank is located in Ladakh. It is located in Svalbard, right? Svalbard in the region around Arctic, right? Now, Svalbard is an area. Okay, locate this on the map then if you don't have an idea. Svalbard is a region off the coast of Norway, pretty close to the region of the Arctic. Sub-freezing temperature almost throughout the year. All the genetic diversity, all the various different seed types, seed varieties of different plant types, flowering plants, food crops, etc., are stored here. So that in the event of a doomsday scenario, in the event where everything simply goes kaput, that is where you have the kind of a genetic resource to reintroduce them into the ecosystem and cultivate them again. Right? Now, why that is done? Why genetic diversity needs to be preserved is because of simple reason. Let's suppose there is some kind of an unforeseen scenario which happens today or tomorrow. Many of the species, they go extinct. Many of the plant species go extinct. Now, even if we try to repopulate the planet with the plants, will we be able to reproduce that genetic diversity? No. Now, if that genetic diversity is not being maintained, many of the animal species will also go extinct because they have a wide variety of requirement of food, right? The different animal species won't be like that, okay, give me a mango tree, give me a banyan tree near my house so that it looks beautiful again and I have good fruits. No, all of them have different requirements. That is why genetic diversity is a must. We'll talk more about genetic diversity when we come to the portion of biodiversity, extinction, etc., why that genetic and species diversity is important. So that is basically cryomesh aims to do that, replicate that by saving or freezing the diversity of corals at very low temperatures, okay, to be reintroduced when the time comes. Now, then we come to the portion of biogeochemical cycles. What are these biogeochemical cycles? Now, across the planet Earth, you have various different systems, subsystems, which keep on happening. And the nutrients in the terms of minerals, for example, they can be reused. They are basically used, exploited, and then they get regenerated back in a system which includes the biological processes, the chemical reactions, and the geological processes included together. So that is how the nutrients of the planet, they keep on getting recharged. For example, water. Water basically is received by rainfall. Now that raindrop or rainwater gets accumulated in the seas, oceans, lakes, rivers, ponds, etc. Now that water then again re-evaporates, forms clouds. brings rain again. So you have a water cycle. For example, carbon. Now, carbon dioxide is produced by us, the species, during respiration, right? Now, that is provided into the atmosphere. Now, that atmospheric carbon dioxide is consumed by the plants to carry out photosynthesis. So, there again, you consume that, then again for respiration, we produce that. So, that is how even carbon gets regenerated. Same is the case with nitrogen, phosphorus, sulfur, and so on. So this is what is known as the recharge of it, the return of it to the ground surface. That is known as biogeochemical cycles. Okay, so they are basically divided into two different types. When we take a look at these two different types, that tells us how that nutrient has been recharged and provided back to the planet Earth. So they are having a subcategory as a gaseous cycle and also a subcategory as a sedimentary cycle. Gaseous cycle basically means that kind of a biogeochemical cycle where atmospheric circulation plays a very important role in the regeneration of the nutrients. So in this, atmospheric circulations play an important role in regeneration. Okay, so they end up playing an important role in the process of recycle and the regeneration of the nutrients. Let me write here recycle also so that it doesn't confuse you. Now, when we talk about sedimentary cycles, here the geological processes on the surface, for example, volcanism, for example, plate tectonics, they play an important role for the recycle of these nutrients, right? So here you have geological processes play a role in recycle. It can also involve atmospheric condition or atmospheric circulation, but a major dominant role is played by the geological processes in action. Now, gaseous cycle, that is the water cycle, carbon cycle, nitrogen cycle, even oxygen cycle. Now, this gaseous cycle is much more efficient, happens over a short time window. And when we say much more efficient, as in, let's suppose the nature consumes 100 units of water, it will be able to recirculate around 90-95% of that. Whereas when we talk about sedimentary cycles, if let's suppose 100% of sulfur is consumed, it will be able to reproduce only around 50-60% of it, right? So this happens with a greater efficiency and over a very short time window. Okay. Now, short time window as in few years, obviously. Now here, when we talk about these cycles, basically if you take a look at it, starting with the easiest and the simplest of one, that is water cycle. Now, water cycle, here, all of us might be aware of that. Let's suppose you have the melting of ice and snow. You have that provides surface water. Then you have rainfall, condensation, right? Precipitation, that provides water. Now, all that water accumulates in the region of the lakes, reservoirs, groundwater, and even in the case of oceans. They will carry out evaporation. Then there will be cloud formation, there will be rainfall, evaporation from land, transpiration from plants, cloud formation brings rainfall. So there is a kind of a completion of this cycle, right? But when we talk about, so this is a simple kind of a cycle where water we do know. Where do we get that water from? By the rains, right? by the clouds. And that water, it fills up the rivers that we have, it fills up the oceans that we have, it fills up the ponds, lakes. It is that water utilized by the animals, it is that water utilized by the plants. The plants will lose them, the land will lose them due to evaporation, and it will be recycled back. So it happens in a short circulation window, right? Then we talk about the carbon cycle. Now, carbon, all the species on planet Earth, all of us, we are carbon-based species. Our body has got a dominant nutrient or a dominant element in the form of carbon. All of us, we are carbon, and even the microscopic ones, they are carbon-based. Now, when you have carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, that is utilized by the plants, by the algae, by the larger plants, smaller plants. They utilize that carbon dioxide. And they utilize it for what? In order to carry out the process of photosynthesis. That is when they utilize that. That is why they utilize that. So they are able to carry out the process of photosynthesis, and they produce oxygen. Now, where has that carbon dioxide gone into when we talk about these plants? They have taken in carbon dioxide. It has turned into a kind of a food or energy source within the plants. And listen to this very carefully. For the next couple of minutes, it will be very clear. So the plants have taken in that carbon dioxide in order to carry out photosynthesis, right? That carbon dioxide undergoes oxidation within the plants, and you have sources of energy, carbohydrates, which are present in the form of the various leaf structure, fruits, etc. So the carbon has gotten converted into the plant matter. Maybe it is consumed by an animal and has basically again been converted into an organic matter. Eventually, let's suppose when you have the mass die-offs of the plants, and the planet has gone through this multiple phases at multiple times in the history, where suddenly almost all the plants, they experienced a mass die-off. So they will get deposited, right? All of them, the dead plants, they will die off. On top of them, you will have more deposits. Now, all those dead plants, over a period of millions of years, undergoing that huge pressure from above, they get converted into coal. You and I, we extract that coal. We burn that coal to produce carbon dioxide back into the atmosphere. So this is one way of regeneration. Another way is where the plants themselves, other than photosynthesis, I hope we are aware that the plants, they carry out respiration as well. Now, in respiration, what do? We also carry out respiration. We take in oxygen, we give out carbon dioxide. So that is another method of the plants returning that carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. Carbon dioxide, for that matter, is absorbed by the ocean surface itself. Ocean surface will also absorb that carbon dioxide. So you have these multiple different sources from where they take in carbon dioxide and they produce carbon dioxide back into the atmosphere. So for example, forest fires, deforestation, when you cut down a tree, a lot of carbon dioxide is emitted when you cut down a tree, right? Transportation, etc. All of that, respiration, all of that produces carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. But that is consumed by photosynthesis, right? So photosynthesis consumes that carbon. It is consumed to be dissolved in the water of the oceans. It is dissolved by or consumed by the planktons in the oceans. So that is how the carbon cycle gets completed. It sometimes can get stored in the rocks also. For example, limestone is rich in carbon. Sometimes it can get stored in the formation of coal. Sometimes in the form of crude oil. Crude oil is formed how? Petroleum, how is petroleum formed? By the dead, decaying marine animals. When you have the layering and the deposits of them, that is when you have the formation of crude oil or petroleum and natural gas. Right? You burn them off, you produce carbon dioxide in the atmosphere once more. Right? So that is basically your carbon cycle. Another form of gaseous cycle is your nitrogen cycle. Now, nitrogen is the most abundant and the dominant gas which is present in the atmosphere. The amount of nitrogen in the atmosphere is close to around 78%, and it has remained static for a very long period of time, because the nitrogen in the atmosphere, that is N2 state, is not very reactive. It doesn't react very easily. So that is why it persists in the atmosphere for a very long duration. But due to events such as, let's suppose, lightning strikes, whenever you have thunder and lightning, that lightning is able to diffuse that atmospheric nitrogen, fix them on the ground, right? You have certain species of microbes which are able to convert that atmospheric nitrogen into ammonia, which can be utilized by the root structures. And then, because the plants, they need nitrogen for the growth. For the growth and the well-functioning metabolism of the plants, nitrogen is a must. So you have nitrogen fixation, which is carried out, right? So here, when you talk about nitrogen by electrical storms, right, nitrogen is fixed to the ground. Many of the times, volcanic activities also produce nitrogen that is fixed as ammonia in the soil decomposition activities. When you carry out burning of fossil fuels, forest fires, many of them, they produce that nitrogen which is released into the atmosphere. Now, you also have nitrification or nitrogen fixation by bacterium, etc., which returns that nitrogen or takes that atmospheric nitrogen, fixes that into the soil to be used by the plants for growth, right? Then you have denitrifying bacteria. Denitrifying bacterium, what do? They convert the ammonium into the soil back into atmospheric nitrogen, which goes back. So that is how the nitrogen cycle is virtually maintained. When we talk about nitrogen fixation, what is it? So certain microorganisms are capable of fixing the atmospheric nitrogen, converting the atmospheric nitrogen into ammonium ions. Ammonium ions means NH4 plus, right? So that is ammonium. Ammonia is NH3. So nitrogen in the air directly cannot be captured by the plants. The roots are able to absorb ammonium ions and the ammonium salts. So that is where these few of the nitrifying microorganisms, what they do, they convert that atmospheric nitrogen into ammonium so that then it can be utilized by the plant species. Okay, so these include free living nitrifying bacterium, for example, aerobic azotobacter and anaerobic clostridium. These are examples of the nitrifying bacteria. And symbiotic nitrifying bacteria, which you will find in the root nodules of the leguminous plants such as peas, pulses, grams, etc. In those plants, the root nodules will have these in the presence of this symbiotic bacterium. They also carry out the process of nitrogen fixation, right? So symbiotic bacteria also living in non-leguminous plants such as rhizobium, as well as the blue-green algae. All of them, they basically convert that N2 into NH4 ammonium, which can be then extracted and utilized by the plant species. Okay? Now, then we come to the sedimentary cycle, that is phosphorus cycle. Phosphorus and sulfur, they are considered to be a part of the sedimentary cycle. Now, when we consider phosphorus, for example, now here you will observe that the geological processes, they are the most dominant ones. For example, the bones of the body, they have phosphate. For example, now I'm talking about the sources of phosphorus, right? Animal excreta, that has got phosphate in it. The bird droppings that you have, that has got phosphate in it. So when these get accumulated, deposited in a region, phosphorus is supplied to the nature. But then, over a period of hundreds and thousands and millions of years, these deposits, they are basically converted into rock systems. These rock systems, due to plate tectonic, etc., basically when they uprise or when they are available, then you have the extract of phosphorus. So for example, I will elaborate again. Phosphate, what is the supply or the source of it? Phosphates in sewage, phosphates as mining waste, phosphates that you use in fertilizers, all of them eventually gets accumulated in the water, right? Then you have phosphates in rocks, that is the bones, fossil, etc. All of that eventually basically turns into the water, maybe gets accumulated in water. You have certain deposits, phosphate in shallow ocean, you have the deposits of them. So over a period of time, these deposits, they get converted into rocks. Now these rocks are not immediately available for extraction. Over a period of hundreds and thousands and millions of years, maybe this underwater rock simply rises up. Maybe this underwater rock, due to plate tectonics, is pushed up, and then you have the phosphate rich rock which you can extract. So that is how the phosphates are utilized. That is why phosphate is not a mineral which is easily available. Phosphate is not a mineral which you find everywhere and anywhere. You have very few limited areas where the phosphates are available. South America is one of those regions which is rich in phosphate, right? That is why India, and in fact the countries across the world, they are basically always targeting trade increase with the region of the South American countries, so as to provide that phosphate, because phosphate is a very important fertilizer, just like nitrogen, required by the plants also. Africa also, yes. Do we inhale CO2 in our daily breath? Yes, we do. Okay. CO2 is black in color? No. CO2 basically is colorless. The CO2, wherever you are sitting, CO2 is present around you. Are you able to see the black gas around you? No. So CO2 is present there. Okay. Now, then we come across to the sulfur cycle. Now, this is for a recharge of the sulfur and the sulfate which is present in the air. Now, this sulfur cycle, this also, here in this cycle and regeneration, atmospheric circulation is also involved. Unlike the phosphorus, where only the weathering and the disintegration of rocks are required, here basically the atmospheric circulation is also involved, but majorly it is a geological process, hence it is a part of a sedimentary cycle. Now, how is it that this sulfur is produced? I hope we are aware about how sulfur is mined. If not, let me tell you how sulfur is mined. Basically, you have these active volcanoes. Now, from these volcanoes, sulfur dioxide, very hot sulfur dioxide, is produced, which is a gas, very, very hot. Now, as soon as it comes in contact with a cold surface, immediately it converts into liquid. Condensation happens. This gas gets converted into liquid. That liquid is basically allowed to accumulate over an area. And then slowly and steadily it cools down to form a kind of a yellowish amorphous solid. And that is sulfur mining, carried out around the regions of active volcanoes across the globe. Indonesia is one of those areas where a lot of that sulfur mining is done. But also, you have many of the microbes also in the oceans which also produce sulfur, right? So there also, sulfur or DMS is one of those byproducts produced by the microbes in the ocean. That is also a supply of sulfur into the atmosphere. So basically, sulfur dioxide in the atmosphere is provided by volcanic eruptions, is provided by the decay of the organisms, etc. All of them, that provides burning of coal, right? Refining of fossil fuels, melting, mining, extraction, all of that produces sulfur. Then that sulfur which is present in the atmosphere, it combines with the raindrops in the form of the acid rain and returns to the ground surface. We'll study about acid rain in the next module. So that sulfur dioxide which is present in the atmosphere readily combines with the water droplets, is returned to the ground surface. And that is when eventually it is utilized by the animals, by the plants, for the microbes, and the sulfur gets fixed into the rocks, etc. Eventually, it is by the disintegration of the rocks where that sulfur again is provided into the atmosphere. But here you have the atmospheric cycle, which plays an important role also. But still, the sulfur cycle is a part of a sedimentary cyclical process. Okay, this is about the various different biogeochemical cycles. Now let us take up a few questions. Have we taken these prelims discussion questions? I don't think so. So let us take up these few of the PYQs related to this. Okay. And let us try to arrive at the answer. So here, in case of which of the following biogeochemical cycle, the weathering of the rock is the main source for the release of nutrients to enter the cycle? Aditya, can it be done near volcanic hotspots? Any active volcano will do. Good. 50% of you have given the correct answer. It is basically C, phosphorus cycle, where weathering of the rocks and the rocky substance is important. Then after that, if rainforests and tropical forests are the lungs of the earth, then surely wetlands function as its kidneys. Remember what is the role that the kidneys play in the body. Which one of the following functions of wetlands best reflects the above statement? The water cycle in wetlands involves surface runoff, subsoil percolation, and evaporation. Algae form the nutrient base upon which fish, crustacean, mollusks, birds, reptiles, and mammals thrive. Wetlands play an important role or play a vital role in maintaining sedimentation balance and soil stabilization. Aquatic plants absorb heavy metals and excessive nutrients. Correct. Yes, correct. Shargun, Santosh, Gayatri, Shalu, Vishal, Tehseen, correct. Anjali, correct. Akshata. So here majority of you have given the incorrect answer. A smaller population of you have given the correct answer in this. So here, what is the role of the kidneys in the body? Kidneys, I hope we are aware, are the purification system of our body metabolism. They basically, you have the impurities which are filtered out in the kidney, and then you have the impurities which are excreted, or basically you the body expels them, and then you have the blood which recirculates back, right? So wetlands, they basically have the aquatic plants which absorb heavy metals and excess nutrients. So if rainforest and tropical forests are the lungs of the earth, they provide oxygen, then surely wetlands function as kidneys. They are acting as a purifier for the ecosystem, acts as a filter, right? So the correct answer is going to be D. In the grasslands, trees do not replace the grasses as part of an ecological succession because of insects and fungi, limited sunlight and paucity of nutrients, water limits and fire, none of the above. Why is it that in the region of the grasslands you have dominance of grasses and trees do not come as a natural successor of that? Lungs of the earth, any of the rainforest is referred to as the lungs. Amazon, Congo rainforest, all of them are referred to as lungs. Yes, correct. Tehseen, Santosh, Chandrasekhar, Shargun, all of you are correct. Avni, Shamil, Vaishna, Prem, Akshata, Purvi, Shalu, correct. Samiksha, good. At least 40% of you have given the correct answer. See, in grasslands, do you have a limitation in the availability of sunlight? Absolutely not. Grasslands basically will have high amount of availability of sunlight. You have very prolonged dry season and a smaller rainy season, isn't it? It is basically the less availability of water because of a smaller rainy season, and also frequent wildfires, due to which the small shrubs, etc., they do not get to dominate. the shrubs which can basically turn out to be trees, they do not dominate. You also have the role played by species such as elephants to ensure that by their trampling of the vegetation, no larger forms of vegetation takes place or comes into existence. Then this is a question that should be very easy. I expect at least 80% of you to give the correct answer. Biorock technology is talked about in which of the following situations? Restoration of damaged coral reefs, development of building materials using plant residues, identification of for areas for exploration or extraction of shale gas, providing salt licks for wild animals in forest or protected areas. Ananya, trust me, it is not something which is diabolical on my side. It is not something which is intentional on my side. But yeah, that's the best explanation I can offer for this. Correct, good. Exactly 80% of you have given the correct answer. So that is basically restoration of the damaged coral reefs, right? So that is where biorock tech comes into prominence. Which of the following add carbon dioxide to the carbon cycle? They add carbon dioxide to the carbon cycle of planet Earth. Volcanic action, respiration, photosynthesis, or decay of organic matter, right? Which one of them basically they add carbon? Correct. Again, I expect most of you to get this correct, guys. Please don't disappoint. Aditya, why environment ecology seems difficult than geography? I'm unable to answer most of the questions. My dear friend, environment ecology is something which, if you are aware about the basic concepts of geography, it should be a natural follow up, right? The aspect here also is, but the benefit other than geography is here. For example, in geography, nobody will be able to tell you that, okay, these are the things happening inside the earth. But in terms of environment ecology, you can observe that happening, unfolding, speciation, extinction, you can observe that. Just keep your eyes and ears open for the surroundings. Try to interrelate the concept of geography with environment. It will be much more tolerable. Nonetheless, so which of them add carbon? Volcanic action, they provide CO2, CO into the atmosphere. Respiration, again, provides, you take in oxygen, provide carbon dioxide. Photosynthesis consumes carbon dioxide, produces oxygen. So photosynthesis will not be there. It consumes CO2. Decay of organic matter also produces CO2. So the correct answer is going to be C, 1, 2, and 4. Now, this is a question which we had already discussed, but let's see. I think we have already discussed this. So here, you gave wrong answer. Where did I give wrong answer in this? Or did I give D in this answer? It is C, my dear friends. Okay. Here, consider the following statements. The soil in tropical rainforests are rich in nutrients. The high temperature and moisture of tropical rainforests, they cause dead organic matter to decompose quickly. So here basically the answer will be, so the statement 1 is soil in tropical rainforests are rich in nutrients. The statement 2 is the high temperature and moisture of tropical rainforest cause dead organic matter to decompose quickly. This statement is correct, but this statement is incorrect. Soil in tropical rainforest are poor in nutrients. That is why the answer will be D. Okay. So that will be the questions, the leaderboard. Yes, the leaderboard. This is your leaderboard. So Nisha, Ananya, SS, Akansha, Anurag, Shamil, Siva, all of you, well done. Beautiful. Beautiful. Shalu, Tehseen, very good. Aditya, you also have gotten only one question incorrect, so it works. Now we come to the portion of pollution. Now here, this is a chapter which generally you will find questions coming both in the prelims area also and mains portion also. But here the question is more or less going to be targeted around the portions of current affairs. Right. Now in this, we are going to study it in the next two modules. In the first module, in this particular module, we are going to study or target about the air pollution. And then in the following module, we shall be talking about the water pollution also. Water, land, sound, noise, etc. Now, what we will be doing is, we will basically be observing this. We will be observing the certain reasons why, for example, North Indian region is much more polluted as compared to the southern part of the country. What do we understand by AQI? The kind of color-coded pattern for the AQI which is there. All these details, ozone hole, depletion, etc., that we will be studying here. You can get a mains question from biogeochemical cycles. Yes, my dear friend. Now, here, we will be covering the portion of air pollution. We will be covering the intricacies of it, the government policies, the Air Act of 1981, and also eventually Montreal Protocol, the questions related to ozone hole depletion, what are the various different amendments to the Montreal Protocol, the Kigali Amendment to the Montreal Protocol, all of that we shall be covering here. So we start with the portion of the air pollution. Now, we all do know what the atmosphere is about. Atmosphere does consist of various different gases from nitrogen, oxygen, argon, carbon dioxide, etc. Now, any unwanted addition to the atmosphere or the air is air pollution. Now, when we talk about air pollution is broadly classified into two types, two categories. When we talk about air pollution, it is broadly classified into two types. One is outdoor air pollution and another is indoor. Well, I always have maintained, and I always, whenever I get a chance to interact with the students in an offline center or anywhere face to face, I always tell them that, look, this is a particular chapter for which I don't think you need a book to help you explain what that pollution is. Particularly living in India, growing up at a stage at which India is. Understand one fact of the matter, guys. 50 years from now, the pollution level in India won't be nearly as much as what we have today. 50 years down the line, maybe in your older ages, India will have much cleaner air, much cleaner water, much cleaner land. 100 years ago, India was not polluted as it is today. So, we all, you and I, we share this timeline. We are present in the country at the stage of its developmental pathway, where the entire country is basically transforming. Air pollution is a sum product of that. We will develop. We will eventually come to a portion or a position where we will have the economic wherewithal to have an air which is as clean as you observe in the European nations. So, as of now, all of us, we have basically been born, brought up, and we have grown in that area in a condition where the air around us is polluted. You step outside your house, you breathe in that polluted air, unless and until you are amongst one of those privileged ones who have got the opportunity to be born, brought up, raised in a kind of a rural area or a region very close to the natural wilderness where you don't have to inhale that polluted air. Now, when we talk about the outdoor pollution is very prominently observed, more prominently observed in northern part of the country as compared to the southern part of the country. Now, why is it that outdoor air pollution happens? Think about it. When we talk about the sources of outdoor air pollution, Please don't learn all of these data pointers. Just have a mere idea that, okay, industry gives, or industry is responsible for more than 50% of outdoor air pollution. That's it. Transportation is responsible roughly around 24 to 25% of the pollution. That's it. Don't start learning all of this. But when we talk about sources of outdoor air pollution, all of you would have observed the older power plants, very old power plants which basically were established in the 60s and the 70s, and they are continuing to function even today. So there you have this pollution which is caused. Then, for example, the process of construction that you carry out. Now, construction activity is being carried out, is being observed all across various different parts of the country. Even for that matter, Mumbai. Mumbai never would be as polluted as a region of Delhi, for example. But in the past few years, Mumbai, during these months, is very polluted. Why? Because of this construction activity. Construction in Mumbai right now, if you go to any part of Mumbai, the construction, the scale of construction is happening at a level which has never been witnessed before. So this emits that dust particles. This releases those dust particles. It basically pollutes the air around. Now, understand that along with that factor, when we consider the climatic condition of India, India is a tropical dry country. Had there not been the presence of Himalayas, mind you, had there not been the presence of Himalayas, India would have been a desert. If you take a look at all the comparative latitudes closer to India, Pakistan, a desertified land, Balochistan, Punjab, the region of Punjab, some parts of it, Iran, the Stelut, one of the driest areas, Saudi Arabia, desert, Sahara, desert, right? The western part of US, a desert. So all the regions in that area, in that latitude, are a desert. India is not, because we receive rains during the monsoons. So in those 2 to 3 months, 3 to 4 months, we do receive rains. But for the remaining part of the year, we have a very dry condition. Now, when you have dry condition, the soil particles, they turn sandy. And then when you have the movement of wind, the movement of air which happens, all that sand particles, they get uplifted and they are moved into the air. That is why you'll find a lot of pollution. So this is something that you all would have witnessed. If you have a speeding bus going on the road, look at the dust that it basically emanates. Where is that dust coming from? From the road, from the sides of the road, isn't it? So that is also a source of pollution, where you have larger particulate matter which is emanated, right? Then vehicular emissions, quite significant. These vehicular emissions, we burn that carbon, we burn the fossil fuels to produce those fumes which pollute the air. Then you have basically older brick kilns, transportation systems, then biomass and open waste burning. We like to burn things. Burning things are something that we like. Any waste that you have, immediately you will find. And those of you belonging from Delhi, NCR, or any part of northern India, where it is a very customary thing to find early in the morning, you'll find that the shopkeepers, and I don't know if you find it in that region where you are living or not, but generally, as you travel across the entirety of the stretch of northern India, this is a common feature. The shopkeepers, early in the morning, when they open up their shops, they first of all clean that area, right? And they accumulate all that garbage from the previous day, etc. They dump that garbage somewhere and they put fire on it, right? That is a kind of a cleansing mechanism, that all the garbage has been burnt, has been taken care of. Now, at the same time, the irony of that will be that those people will be standing there and they will be complaining about that how much pollution is there in the air around us. It is you who is causing that pollution by burning that. When you burn the biomass. Let's suppose the dried grass, leaves, twigs, branches, etc. You burn them off. Excuse me. Excuse me. Or when you burn, let's suppose, a garbage item which has got carbon present in it. All the materials have paper has carbon in it, right? Plastic has carbon in it. You burn them off. Now you are basically releasing small amount of carbon particles, etc., into the air, which will be inhaled by the larger population. All of this adds to the source of pollution. You have the industries, various different industries, which are the source of pollution. So all these, they add the pollutants to the atmosphere. Now, pollution can also be caused naturally, by the way. Pollution naturally is also created. I hope we are aware of that. For example, when you have these wetlands, right? We have given the example of what the paddy field acting as a temporary wetlands. Now, when you have that water evaporating from that wetland, methane which has been trapped in that water, methane is released into the atmosphere. Now, that methane is also a greenhouse gas, by the way. It causes warming, right? Anywhere where you have accumulated water which evaporates, methane is released. Then, for example, sometimes when you have forest fires, wildfires, carbon dioxide, black carbon, carbon monoxide, all of that is supplied into the atmosphere. When you have volcanic eruptions, the amount of carbon dioxide released, the amount of sulfur dioxide released is so humongous in the same area. Human activities cannot surpass that, right? And this has happened. This has been happening. The natural forces have been acting for millions and millions of years. Generally, the cycle that you observe on the planet, if you go back for the entire duration of around 600 to 1 billion years, 600 million years to around 1 billion years, you'll find that suddenly, after every few hundred million years, the planet comes into that active volcanic phase where everywhere you have volcanic events. Now that carries on for a certain number of millions of years. Now all that volcanic gas or events releases so much amount of carbon dioxide which stays in the atmosphere. That causes the warming of the planet. That causes the melting of ice, etc. Everything freezes again back up. So that is where the natural sources are also there, which provide that pollution. But they have a kind of a propensity to find natural balance. It is our own human contribution that we carry out on our own. That is what is disturbing the natural ecosystem. That is why pollution needs to be controlled. Okay? Now, here, when we talk about indoor air pollution, the indoor air pollution, let's suppose in a room, in your house, if there is not proper ventilation, there also you have that pollution. For example, cooking. Now, not any kind of a cooking, but let's suppose you are carrying out the process of cooking by burning of wood or coal or any form of charcoal for that matter. It will release pollutants always, right? I hope you remember that when you had the Ujjwala scheme, which was launched by the government to provide that LPG cylinders in the households, you had the Ministry of Health coming up with the data that in the rural households, where it has been a norm for centuries that in the small areas, the generally that is the case in the rural households where it is only the women folk, sadly, who have got this duty to cook. Now they basically burn the dung, the cow dung, cakes, etc. They burn the wood. Sometimes in certain areas they also burn the cheap coal, and that is used to produce heat. The amount of smoke that it produces, it is similar to inhaling multiple tens of cigarettes at one time, 80 to 100 cigarettes at one time. So that is where respiratory illnesses are a norm in those areas, right? So there also you have a source of indoor pollution. Then poor ventilation is basically the root cause of it. If the area is properly ventilated, then you don't have that problem exaggerating itself. But then freshly painted rooms, many of you would have the kind of a propensity or kind of a habit that you would ask your landlords that, okay, paint the room fresh and then immediately I will move in, or I won't move in, or this room is freshly painted now. But if you ever have been to a freshly painted room, you have a unique kind of a smell. Many of the times the paints consist of elements such as lead that is inhaled. When you inhale elements such as lead, you are basically going to, or this is going to lead to nervous damage. Nerves, they start getting damaged, mostly in the young ones, the tiny tots. Adults, not so much. But you also have various different chemicals such as formaldehyde, etc., that you inhale. Now, that is very poisonous for the body, right? Then you have scented items, the scented candles that you have, the scented incense sticks that you have, the room fresheners that you spray. Before someone special comes in, you spray the room with the room freshener. What is that? It consists of elements such as benzene, formaldehyde, toluene. Now, that is, again, pollutant. I don't know how many of you remember, but I'm sure you would remember during the COVID days, you had the disinfectants, which started doing the round, where the people would spray disinfectant over everything, over themselves also. Now, that is also containing pollutant, right? You are inhaling them. That causes respiratory illnesses of quite a larger scale. Then pet dander. If you keep the pets around, right? Those of you who have pets at your home. So pets, they go for a kind of the small hair along with small particles. Oftentimes, if you don't shed or if you don't comb them regularly, the cats, the dogs, etc., they will have that. The small, very small hair particles, etc., which are so very light, they can be uplifted by the fan air also. So you inhale that. Few of them, the mucous membrane of your skin will be able to eliminate, but many of them will be inhaled. So that is again harmful. It causes various issues, respiratory illnesses. Smoking releases various different types of pollutants into the atmosphere. But overall, wherever you have all these sources, you have or you experience the indoor air pollution, where you have gases such as benzene, toluene, formaldehyde, carbon monoxide in certain cases, such as cooking, etc., that is carried on. Right? So, all of that basically leads to indoor air pollution. We'll study more about this as we move ahead, as we carry out the discussion tomorrow. We'll talk about the Delhi air pollution. We'll talk about in general, the pollution in northern part of the country, the government measures, the Air Act, the ozone pollution, the ozone depletion, the recovery of ozone, Montreal-Kigali amendment, and then after that we'll move to water and land pollution. I hope the session has added some value to your existing information set, and now we'll take a few questions. Will we have separate discussion on stubble burning? Tomorrow only we'll discuss. Non-stick utensils which emit HCFCs, yes. And pet dander is basically the pets. I'm sure you have not kept or you have not taken care of a pet uh, in till now. So basically, whenever you keep a pet in your home or your house, now they go for a regular shedding of their hair, right? I'm just talking about the dogs and the cats, which are the most common pets, right? Now, many of those particles are so very small that as they shed that gets uplifted in the air, and that is what is inhaled. So we are talking about small particles which are basically trapped within the hair, and the small hair parts also, which basically are deshed. Deshedding happens by these animals. Sedimentary cycle XY is basically when you have the geological processes such as plate tectonics, the disintegration of the rocks, etc. They are responsible for the recycle. For example, phosphorus. Now, all the phosphorus from the various sources, they get deposited as sediments underwater. Now, over a period of time, they will get converted into sedimentary rocks. Now, how do you get that phosphorus back available? Right? How do you get that? So eventually, maybe after hundreds and thousands of years, that phosphate rock will be uplifted by plate tectonics or by any of the endogenic process of the planet Earth, and that will come above the surface. And that is when you mine them, right? And Santosh from both of them. Aditya, yes. Pet dander can cause asthma, even bronchitis for that matter. Can mangroves grow on wetlands? Yes. Does boiling water release methane? No. If it is only water. And Vivek, nitrogen cycles with respect to animal, as in poor ventilation. Ventilation, I hope you are aware. Ventilation is what? Allowing the passage of air from one portion to the other. So if poor ventilation basically means that the air is not able to circulate within the room, so the pollutants stay in that region for a longer period of time. And high people density means in a small area, if you have larger number of people living, pollution will also be larger. That is as simple as it is. Scented items, most of them, they have chemicals laced within them so that they are able to spread in the air. So that is why they are harmful. Construction dust basically is the smaller particles, the dust particles, which are whenever you have road construction or building construction, etc. So the smaller dust particles, etc., which are released. Okay. Is current affairs of environment ecology enough from monthly magazine? Yes. Just follow Down to Earth also if you can, Vishal. Right. And okay. So that shall be all for today. We meet again tomorrow. Do take care of yourself. Goodbye. Thank you.